storage business at MOD East Riggs. DNS continue to manage the site and may support initiatives to commercially exploit the rail infrastructure, provided any increase in use does not conflict with the primary demands of defence.
Stuart Malcolm MacDonald.
Can the Secretary of State commit to publishing his department's analysis of leaving the European Union as far as forfeiting our rights and responsibilities of 42.7 of the Lisbon Treaty is concerned?
Secretary of State.
I'll be delighted to write to the honourable member on that point.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Given the surprise at the speed with which the Americans fled from the scene in Syria, can the Minister tell me what preparations he's making for greater logistical independence for Her Majesty's Armed Forces so they don't feel abandoned?
Minister Lancaster.
Well, the UK remains fully committed to the long-term security of the region and to the counter-Daesh coalition. We continually assess the UK and coalition logistical capability to ensure we are well placed to continue to contribute to the counter-Daesh effort. We remain at the forefront of the coalition's air campaign.
Jenny Chapman.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's just not possible to recognise the sacrifice and the service of our armed forces in pay alone. But it is wrong that the salary of a new recruit is now worth over £1,000 less per year than it was 10 years ago. So what is the Minister going to do, and when will the pay of a new recruit match what it was 10 years ago in real terms?
Mr. Lancaster.
My understanding is that I'm delighted to say that as a result of the recent pay review, actually the starting salary of a private soldier has risen to over £20,000.
Field.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. What steps are being taken to protect veterans who have served in Northern Ireland?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The issue of protecting our servicemen and women from vexatious and repeated prosecution in Northern Ireland is something this government takes incredibly seriously. Regular meetings are now ongoing between myself, the Attorney General, Secretary of State and Secretary of State in Northern Ireland. We are absolutely committed to the Prime Minister's destination that there will not be any vexatious, repeated allegations and prosecutions without new evidence, and we will achieve that objective.
Yamadenko.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. We heard earlier about the failures of Capita on army recruitment and Carillion, of course, on army accommodation. Isn't it time to review the costly procurement process whereby the government just last month signed a £1.6 billion contract to decommission Sellafield to Morgan Sindall, responsible for the Fastlane Leisure Centre supermess?
I thank the Honourable Lady for her question. Sadly, I cannot speak for procurement of other departments, but I can reassure that in my new role I take how we do procurement, with who and how we will manage those contracts extremely seriously.
Robinson.
Thank you. In London, some veterans are eligible for free travel under the Veterans Concessionary Travel Scheme. However, in Greater Manchester, our service veterans don't have the benefit of travelling free on public transport all year round. Transport's a devolved power, and after years of service, I believe our veterans should be afforded a gold standard of treatment on our transport network. What discussions have the Minister had with the Mayor of Greater Manchester on this point?
Mercer.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I've not had any discussions with the Mayor of Greater Manchester on this issue. As transport is devolved to the Greater Manchester Authority, it's for them to decide. However, as a supporter of the Armed Forces Covenant, Transport for Greater Manchester provides free travel on Metrolink for our veterans on important days such as Remembrance Sunday. But I am, of course, happy to meet the Mayor to discuss this further.
Mrs. Helen Goodman.
Speaker, I met some veterans from the Far East in the 1950s, and they impressed upon me the gross unfairness of the fact that some of them had served for 15 years. Will the government change the rule that means people who served before 1975 have to have served for 22 years to get a full pension?
So in respect of pensions pre-1975, it's been a long-standing convention that lies with the Treasury, and it is simply, we simply do not have the resources to backdate that previously, as has always been the case with pensions across the public sector.
Mr. Speaker, the recent attack on the Saudi oil facility was carried out using small pilotless drones capable of flying hundreds of miles. Can the Minister tell the House what defence the UK has against such similar attacks?
Minister.
Well, within the United Kingdom, the Home Office has responsibility for counter-drone activity. The MOD has a layered air defence capability, and we are happy to allow other departments to use that capability when they specifically request so.
Emma Hardy.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Minister will be aware that the Hawk manufacturing at Brough is due to end in 2020 after over 100 years of aircraft manufacture. I thank her for agreeing to meet with me on Wednesday, but ahead of that meeting, please will she consider all suitable BAE MOD contracts and what pressure can be put on BAE to insist that some of those are manufactured in Brough?
I've regularly met the unions from Brough over the years, and not only because I represent a site in Lancashire that also represents BAE workers. The key for BAE is for us to support them getting more export bids and also at the same time invest in the next generation of fighter. And with that, we will make sure that with our money and your taxpayers' money comes a commitment from BAE that the jobs are as much based here throughout the country as they've always been.
For goodwill.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My honourable friend from Chelmsford mentioned cadets in the community, but the cadet expansion programme is about establishing 500 new cadet units in state schools. What assessment has my right honourable friend made of the value of cadet units for some of our most disadvantaged children in some of our most challenging schools?
Minister.
The University of Northampton's research into the social impact of cadet forces, which includes those in state schools, suggests that membership can increase social mobility and help children reach their potential because of the activities they undertake, and this is precisely why this has been such a successful process.
Carol Monaghan.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Secretary of State will be aware of reports of the use of white phosphorus by Turkey in northern Syria. What is he doing to assist NATO allies in the investigation into this?
The Honourable Lady is right. White phosphorus is only permitted for using as signals and markers. It is not allowed by Geneva Convention to be used as a weapon. A number of people are collecting evidence about that incident and many other incidents. When that evidence is presented either to me or indeed to OPCW or the UN, then I think we will consider together what the next step should be.
Finally, because he mustn't miss out, Ranald Wardener.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I welcome what the Minister has just said and what the Prime Minister has said repeatedly in March and July and last week, that we mustn't let politics trump justice. I trust that legislation is coming to stop vexatious prosecutions, but when?
So the department has completed a consultation that closed only last week, brought forward by the previous Secretary of State around enhanced legal protections. We're now collecting those responses and we'll look forward to bring forward a bill in early of the new year.
Order. I wish to make a statement to the House. On Saturday last, at column 658, the Leader of the House rose on a point of order to announce the government's intention to bring forward a motion today under Section 13(1)(b) of the European Union Withdrawal Act 2018. Unfortunately, the point of order did not prove to be a prelude to an emergency business statement on which colleagues could question, probe and scrutinise the leader. Rather, for approximately an hour, 30 points of order were raised by no fewer than 24 colleagues, with me expressing disquiet and consternation that the government intended to require the House to consider again on Monday the same matter which it had decided 48 hours earlier on the immediately preceding sitting day. It was my privilege to listen and respond to the views of colleagues. I then undertook to reflect further on what members had said and to give a ruling this afternoon, which I shall now do. There are two issues, one of substance and the other of circumstances, to consider. I shall address each in turn. First, I have to judge whether the motion tabled under Section 13(1)(b) of the 2018 Act for debate today is the same in substance as that which was decided on Saturday. Page 397 of Erskine May is clear that such a motion may not be brought forward again during that same session. It is equally clear that adjudication of cases is a matter for the Chair. I invoked Erskine May and ruled on this issue as recently as March the 18th this year. Saturday's motion sought approval for the withdrawal agreement, the political declaration on the future relationship between the EU and the UK, and the declaration concerning the operation of the democratic consent in Northern Ireland provision. Today's motion seeks approval for the withdrawal agreement, the political declaration on the future relationship between the EU and the UK, and the declaration concerning the operation of the democratic consent in Northern Ireland provision. It is clear that the motions are in substance the same. However, this matter was decided fewer than 49 hours ago. After more than 3 hours of debate, the House voted by 322 to 306 for Sir Oliver Letwin's amendment, which stated that, and I quote, "This House has considered the matter but withholds approval unless and until implementing legislation is passed," unquote. The second matter for me to consider was whether there had been any change of circumstances that would justify asking the House to reconsider on Monday what it had decided on Saturday. On the face of it, unless an event or development external to the House had interceded, it is hard to see a significant change of circumstances that would warrant a reconsideration on the next sitting day. In this case, a reconsideration pre-announced by the Leader of the House just under 21 minutes after the result of the division was announced. However, the government might argue, though to date it hasn't put forward any argument or explanation at all, that the change of circumstances is the Prime Minister's application on Saturday night for an extension of Article 50. This is not persuasive. The application is... This is not persuasive. The application is part of a process rather than a significant event in itself. In summary, today's motion is... I'm extraordinarily grateful to the honourable gentleman. If he'd bear stoically and with fortitude, I shall complete my statement. In summary, today's motion is in substance the same as Saturday's motion, and the House has decided the matter. Today's circumstances are in substance the same as Saturday's circumstances. My ruling is therefore that the motion will not be debated today, as it would be repetitive and disorderly to do so. For the benefit of colleagues not closely familiar with the so-called same question convention, which is very strong and dates back to 1604, I will summarise the rationale for it in a sentence. It is a necessary rule to ensure the sensible use of the House's time and proper respect for the decisions that it takes. If it is not legitimate for the motion to be taken today, what is it legitimate for the government to do? The answer is that As the Prime Minister himself signalled in his point of order on Saturday at column 653 and in his letter to members that evening, the Government can introduce its EU withdrawal and implementation bill. Indeed, it has done just that, presenting the bill for its first reading today. I have no doubt that the leader will offer further details of the intended timetable for the bill when he makes a business statement later today. Meanwhile, I hope that this ruling and explanation are helpful to the House. Order.
Point of order, sir.
Yes, point of order, Mr. Peter Bercow.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I entirely follow the logic of your argument. But what weight did you give to the point that when we were debating on Saturday, nobody knew whether the Prime Minister was going to send a letter or not? And since that has happened, whilst you are quite correct, sir, to say that the motion is the same, an event outside has dramatically changed it. And given that the motion on Saturday is very clear that final approval can't be done until the deal has gone through in legislation, would it not be, as you've always said, to let the House decide on this matter, notwithstanding the fact that the previous motion is clear what actually is going to happen? It would give the country the opportunity to know whether this House approves or disapproves of the Prime Minister's deal.
I'm really grateful to the honourable gentleman for his point of order. My response is as follows. I did not consider, in reaching a judgment on this matter, whether a letter would be sent. The letter was sent on Saturday evening. More widely, however, the question of whether it would be a material consideration for the Chair whether a Minister of the Crown would obey the law, the honest answer to the honourable gentleman is that that consideration had not entered my mind as pertinent to my reflection on the matter. I note the wider point that the honourable gentleman makes, and I respect the fact that it is a point of view. And I intend no discourtesy to the honourable gentleman when I say that I think I have made the argument for and explained the rationale behind the judgment that I have made. I'm not seeking to rubbish the honourable gentleman. I'm simply making... No, I'm not seeking to rubbish the honourable gentleman. I'm simply making the point that, having reflected on all of the considerations and the interests of the House, I have reached the conclusion I have reached. And it is important that colleagues hear all parts of it. And the honourable gentleman didn't like part of it, as is politely explained in his point of order, but he will also have heard me say what is open to the government to do. And the government can introduce its bill, and the government can propose a programme motion for it, and the government can proceed with the support of the House between now and the end of the month, as collectively Parliament prescribes. And that seems to me to be entirely proper. I will come to other colleagues. Yes, I'll come to other... particularly the illustrious chair of the European Scrutiny Committee. But first of all, a point of order, Mr Kevin Brennan.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. As you'll recall, on Saturday afternoon, I was the honourable member who raised the issue that the Leader of the House should have been making an emergency business statement at that time, rather than relying on the device of a point of order to try to change the business today. I described it at the time as low-rent, jiggery-pokery. Isn't it time, Mr Speaker, that the government, instead of playing games with the business of this House, actually subscribe to the usual practices, inform the opposition of their intentions, and indeed inform the Speaker of this House of their intentions in advance, so that we can all get on and with the important business we have to conduct?
Well, I'm grateful to the honourable gentleman. Look, let's focus on the arguments and the issues as somebody, a very long-serving member of this House once said, sadly no longer with us, it's not about policies, it's about policies, it's not about personalities. It's not about personalities, it's about policies. And so I don't want to get into the personalities of it. I know that the Leader of the House disapproves of jiggery-pokery, because I've heard him say so in the past. If memory serves me correctly, on March the 26th, 2015, in the Chamber, he made that very point, that he deprecated the use of jiggery-pokery. I don't want to get into that. I suppose what I want to say is this. There are precedents for changes in business being announced on points of order. It's not the norm, but there are precedents. And I don't want to ascribe any improper motive to the Leader of the House, whose personal courtesy to me over the years has been and remains unfailing. I hope I have reciprocated it. He made the judgment he made. There was very little notice that he was going to say what he said, but that was really perhaps a product of the circumstances. The honourable gentleman might think the circumstance could have been anticipated and some advance notice would have been helpful, but we were where we were, and I don't complain about having to respond to points of order. The Leader didn't stay for all the points of order, he stayed for some of them, but I feel certain that he will since have familiarised himself with all of them. We will hear from the Leader of the House later, and I'm sure we look forward to that. Yes, of course, yes. Well, first of all, point of order, Sir William Cash.
I'm most grateful, Mr. Speaker. On a point of order which I made a couple of days ago, I made the point that the law of the land is that set out in Section 1 of the Withdrawal Act 2018, and that quite unequivocally states that the European Communities Act is repealed on exit day, which is the 31st of October. The Ben Act has not done anything yet other than in respect of the letter to change the repeal of the 1972 Act. Therefore, I would simply argue, and I would put it to you, that the question of whether or not, as you mentioned in your statement, there are issues relating to whether or not the law is being obeyed, is not an issue at this stage in the proceedings. For that reason, I simply say to you, if I may, would it be possible for you to reconsider your decision, because I'm afraid that the reality is that the law of the land remains, as I've said last Friday.
I'm extremely grateful to the honourable gentleman, whose experience in these matters and whose prowess as a lawyer I readily acknowledge. I hope he won't take it amiss, but if he does, it's a regrettable inevitability when I say that the honourable gentleman has put on the record his understanding of the legal position, and he has said it with crystal clarity this afternoon as on previous occasions. Other people have a different view about the legal position and the significance of the so-called Ben Act. If memory serves me correctly, I did not dwell in my statement on adherence to the law. I touched on that matter only in response to the point of order from the honourable gentleman, the member for Wellingborough. I totally understand what the honourable gentleman thinks and why. Moreover, I made clear in the statement the option open to the government, and I reiterated it in response to the honourable member for Wellingborough. The amendment, I remind not just members but those attending our proceedings, in the name of Sir Oliver Letwin, explicitly specified that the legislation should come first. Suddenly to have, at the next sitting day, a debate on the same matter upon which an explicit conclusion was reached on Saturday would seem very unusual. And I have made the judgment I have made. Colleagues, I'm stating the obvious, but when you make a judgment on these matters, manifestly, some people, if it's controversial, are pleased, and other people are displeased. That is in the nature of the responsibility. I have simply sought to discharge my obligations and to do what I believe to be right, and that is what the Speaker has to do. Yes, point of order, Angela Regal. Of course I'll come to the honourable lady.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My point of order is about the nature of this
power in the chair to prevent Parliament being asked to vote again and again and again on the same thing. Surely this is to prevent an over-powerful executive attempting to demand,
The honourable gentleman, I can't quite read his lips, but I think he's saying if only.
Yes.
I think he's saying if only. But the honourable lady must be heard. Angela Eagle.
Speaker, it's an attempt to prevent an executive from browbeating Parliament and making certain that it votes again and again and again on the same thing until it gets it right. Now, surely, Mr. Speaker, this is an important defence of freedom in our democracy. And does he agree with me that when we have a government which is attempting to browbeat Parliament and set up a Parliament versus the people false narrative, that this is even more important?
The short answer to the honourable lady is yes. I sought, colleagues, to frame my statement in factual terms, and it was, whether people agree with it or not, closely argued. And I did not go in for adjectival excess on this occasion. It is, however, part of the thinking of the chair that the House should not be continually bombarded with a requirement to consider the same matter over and over and over again. And there are people who are concerned about such a prospect, the possibility of being browbeaten or harassed or intimidated. And in the context of the March the 18th statement that I made to the House, I was very aware of commentary in the public square along the lines of, well, we'll bring it back 26 times if necessary until we get the outcome. And that was a factor in my judgment that a ruling from the chair needed to be given. Absence of Speaker intervention on this matter, on the same question convention, since 1920 or thereabouts, is attributable, colleagues, not to the discontinuation of the convention, but rather to general compliance with it. And it is for the protection of the House. And we also don't want contradictory and conflicting judgments to be reached in very short order. And what could be shorter order than the next sitting day after the last judgment was made? It may not appeal to everybody, but that is the rationale for the perfectly reasonable judgment that I have made. Point of order, Mr. Bernard Jenkins. Sir Bernard Jenkins.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rather imagine that if you didn't enjoy being bombarded, you wouldn't enjoy so much sitting in that chair. And I note the dilemmas you face mean that on occasion you will sometimes have to please some and not others, but it is becoming remarkable how often you please one lot and not the other lot. I would also remark, Mr. Speaker, that you have inveighed against most unusual things happening in this House which you did not like. And I would say it is most unusual for a Speaker so often to prevent the government having debated the matters which the government wished to put before the House. And it has also been one of your mantras, Mr. Speaker, that the House should be permitted to express its view, even when it comes to changing the meaning of standing orders. And yet you have denied the opportunity of the House to express its view on this matter, because this motion was never voted on Saturday. No.
Want the honourable gentleman to be heard, as he must be, fully and without fear or favour, and then I know he will allow me the courtesy of an uninterrupted response. Sir Bernard Jenkins.
Because this motion was never voted upon, it ceased to exist. It ceased to exist as soon as it was amended, and I confess, Mr. Speaker, surprised that the reason for my right honourable friend's amendment my right honourable friend for South Dorset's amendment being tabled failed to enter your head, because the reason was there was an anxiety that the law was not going to be complied with and the letter would not be sent. So the circumstances have changed in that respect. And can I just alert you and the House, Mr. Speaker, to the fact that my committee will be holding a hearing on the role of the Speaker. It has to be said somewhat in the light of the experience of recent months.
First of all, let me say I'm grateful to the honourable gentleman for his multifaceted point of order, and it was multifaceted. There were several features to it, and that's important. Secondly, I say to the honourable gentleman that I hear what he says about his committee conducting an inquiry into the role of the Speaker, and that's absolutely proper, and I think he said something from a sedentary position about tomorrow and evidence being taken and witnesses being heard, and that's absolutely right. I don't know what he expects me to deduce from that. I wouldn't dream of seeking to comment adversely, still less to trespass, which it would be quite improper to seek to do, upon the legitimate autonomy of any select committee of this House. And it's perfectly proper for his committee to do that. I'm entirely untroubled by it, and it's a reflection of his conscientiousness that he should undertake such an inquiry. Thirdly, what I say to the honourable gentleman, and there are people in this chamber who know very well the truth of what I say to the honourable gentleman, with respect to how unfortunate that one side seems to be disadvantaged by judgments from the chair. Let me say to the honourable gentleman, I haven't got off the top of my head a count of the number of times that I have granted in the past urgent questions and, in some cases, though they were less fashionable at the time, emergency debates to people of what was then called a Eurosceptic disposition and would now be called a Brexiteer disposition. And the honourable gentleman was one of them. And when I was granting the honourable gentleman and some of his honourable and right honourable friends the opportunity to challenge, to question, to probe, to scrutinise, in some cases to expose what they thought were the errors of omission or commission of the government of the day, I don't recall the honourable gentleman complaining that I was giving him too many opportunities to make his point, and it wasn't a fair use of the House's time, and it was very unfair on his party, and it was a violation of the rights of his government. Now, it may be that sotto voce he was somehow making this point, but if so, I didn't hear it. And I remind the honourable gentleman additionally, and I think fourthly, that yes, and I will make the point because it's an important point to make, that his honourable friend, the member for Basildon and Billericay, tabled an amendment to the Queen's speech in 2013 on the case for a referendum on UK membership of the European Union, a most unusual, though perfectly proper thing for a government backbencher to do. And I selected that amendment, and I did so because I thought that it was well supported and there was a compelling case for it to be considered. So what I'm saying to the honourable gentleman is that when he was getting the decisions in his favour, he wasn't grumbling. He's grumbling now because he doesn't like the judgment. But the judgment I've made is an honourable and fair one, and I'm afraid if the honourable gentleman doesn't like it, there's not much I can do about that. I'm trying to do the right thing for the House as a whole. And my last point, yes, my last point to the honourable gentleman is this, and it's very important not just for members or even particularly for members in the House, but for those observing our proceedings. Nothing in what I have said in any way impinges upon the opportunity for the government to secure approval of its deal and the passage of the appropriate legislation by the end of the month. If the government have got the numbers, the government can have their way, and it's not for the Speaker to interfere. The judgment I've made is about the importance of upholding a very long-standing and overwhelmingly observed convention of this House. That is what I've done, and I make absolutely no apology for it whatsoever. Point of order, Caroline Flint.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I'm seeking clarification on the implications of the Benn Act to the proceedings over the next week or so. And I'm happy to put it in writing if that's helpful, and I'm sorry for not having done so already. The Benn Act, as the Speaker knows, was amended by the amendment put forward by my honourable friend, the member for Aberavon. And if you recall in the debate, Mr. Speaker, my right honourable friend, the member for Birkenhead, asked my right honourable friend, the member for Leeds Central, why there was no purpose to his bill, to which the latter member of Parliament said, we don't want a purpose on this bill, and the implication was to keep it open-ended. Clearly, the amendment that was then passed by this House included the amendment by my honourable friend, the member for Aberavon, which stated very clearly that there could be no extension beyond the 31st of October unless it was to secure a deal. So could I have maybe some clarification from the Speaker, or maybe in writing tomorrow, that when amendments come forward over the next few days or the next few weeks, only amendments that are pertinent to securing the deal in relation to the essence of that deal, rather than revoking Article 50 or have a second referendum, will be the ones that will be taken, because it is all about securing the deal.
To the right honourable lady is twofold. First of all, it's not for the chair to interpret the Act. People will make their own assessment of that. That doesn't fall to me. Secondly, if the right honourable lady wishes to engage with me on that matter in correspondence, I'm not promising to come back to her tomorrow. I will study any letter from her and respond in as timely a way as I can, compatible with a substantive response being provided, and I should be very delighted to try to oblige the right honourable lady in that regard. Yes. Yes, of course. Point of order, Mr. Steve Baker.
Mr. Speaker, would it not be better to save consideration of these matters until the business statement so that we can hear from the Leader of the House of Commons?
That's perfectly possible. For that to be the case, a self-denying ordinance is required on the part of people who otherwise wish to raise points of order with me. But I note what the honourable gentleman has said, and colleagues either will be guided by him or not, as the case may be. Point of order, Dr. Sarah Wollaston.
Mr. Speaker, could I make a helpful suggestion that you send a photocopy of Erskine May to members of the government? But on a more serious point, well, it's true.
I want a second vote.
That the government keeps insisting that members of this House should have the opportunity to change their mind. Isn't it time they extended the same courtesy to the British people?
Yeah. Well, I note what the honourable lady has said. The second point is a political one, to which I won't respond. In relation to Erskine May, it is available free online. In relation to the same question convention, I simply make the point that when I pronounced on the same question convention on the 18th of March, one of the early responses came from an honourable member who said, "May I say how delighted I am that you have decided to follow precedent, which is something I am greatly in favour of." And he went on to make other supporting points. The person who responded in that way was none other than the right honourable gentleman, the member for North East Somerset, the Leader of the House. So the Leader of the House was very much with me at that time on the same question convention. I take the same view 7 months later, and it is for him to explain whether he does. Point of order, Sir Desmond Sway.
However unfashionable it might be, Mr. Speaker, I believe you're quite right. And by the same token, it's quite wrong to expect the voters to have to answer the same question a second time.
Look, I've known the right honourable gentleman member for New Forest West for 22 years. I like him so much that I don't want to ruin a burgeoning political career, as he's only probably a quarter of the way through his. But one of the great merits of the right honourable gentleman member for New Forest West is that he is a model of consistency, principle and fair-mindedness. Point of order, Sir Robert Sims.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. The meaningful vote process was a process which Parliament insisted that the government adhere to. And all the government are trying to do is to stick to a process set out by Parliament. And clearly, on Saturday, things were amended. Now we can have a clean vote, because I think there is an appetite among the country, if not this Parliament. I mean, they're not exactly empty benches here to try and get a view on what the Prime Minister's deal is about. The fact of the matter is, I agree with Sir Desmond Swain. I think your ruling is probably right, except that we are prone, unlike most of Erskine in May, to the EU Constitution. And the EU Constitution means at the moment we leave at the end of this month, which means there's limited time. So we're going to be treated to the spectacle of empty benches in this House as we go home at some point, and maybe sitting late or sitting at weekends in order to try and get government legislation on the statute book. And I'm not sure the British people will understand that.
Well, just say to the honourable gentleman, and I genuinely apologise to him if I have misunderstood any part of his point, but I am reacting on the hoof. Whether there were the debate today or not, the government requires the passage of the requisite legislation. Therefore, insofar as the right honourable gentleman is concerned about the time required for the legislation, the programme motion for it, the sitting hours entailed by it, the inconvenience that might flow from it, those considerations would apply whether we had the debate today or not. The issue is, do we make a pragmatic judgment and allow for the breach of a long-standing convention, or do we make a principled judgment? And I have made a principled judgment, and there is every opportunity for the government, with the support of the House, not only to have its say, but to get its way by the end of October. And I don't think I need to add anything to that. It is dependent on parliamentary opinion. I will come to the honourable lady. Point of order, Mr. Crispin Blunt.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. But before you reflect on it, I acknowledge we have known each other for over 30 years, and in many ways our personal political lives seem to have gone off in very different directions in the course of that time. And I acknowledge the kind remarks you made to me on another occasion outside this House last week. But I am one of the members who has formally recorded my anxiety about your partiality in the chair, and I think the right way to do that is to do it formally. But having done that, like my honourable friend for New Forest West, and having noted the narrow terms in which you gave your ruling today, I think those terms are reasonable in you coming to your judgment. However, is a sufficient change of circumstances us knowing what the response to the letter imposed upon the government by this House to request an extension, then for you to reconsider the conclusions you came to today?
Well, as the honourable gentleman will know, repetition is not a novel phenomenon in the House of Commons, including when perpetrated by me. I have made the point often, and forgive me, but I make it again, that I tend to subscribe to the dictum of the late Lord Whitelaw in these matters. He famously used to say, personally, I think it is better to cross bridges only when I come to them. It's a hypothetical question. I would have to reflect on it and make a judgment in the circumstances of the time. I don't want to fall out with the honourable gentleman, and I appreciate his courteous opening remarks. He won't be surprised to know, though I absolutely defend his right to his opinion, that I don't accept his characterisation of my speakership. I have tried to do the right thing by Parliament. Sometimes people like it when it goes their way, and sometimes they don't when it doesn't. But that is my honest approach. If he disapproves of it, I am sorry about that, because I've known him a long time, but I will live with that. And I don't mean that in any discourteous or patronising way. I will live with that. It is one verdict, and there will be others. But I've made the judgment I've made, and let's wait and see how events develop. Yes, indeed. Point of order, Harriet Baldwin.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. This is a genuine point of order. And my understanding of Erskine May is that the repeat question applies to a session of Parliament. So the fact that we've had a prorogation since the 29th of March might mean that the government, I'm not saying they would want to do this, they could bring back the same question as they asked the House on the 29th of March. And secondly, would they be able to ask a variant of the motion on the order paper today that included subsections 1 and 3, for example?
Well, I'm very grateful to the honourable lady, and it is a genuine point of order, and my response to it is as follows. First, when I referred, and I don't mean this impolitely, not to the 29th of March, but to the 18th of March, I was not referring to a motion on that day, which was indeed in the last session. I was referring to the statement or ruling that I gave at the time on the same question convention. The ruling on the same question convention has not just survived from one session to another, it has in fact survived for the last 415 years. So I don't think we need trouble ourselves unduly on that matter. Secondly, I very specifically was making the point that the matter has been treated of as recently as Saturday, with a very clear decision reached by the House on the amendment to the motion, and therefore it would not be appropriate to consider that matter today. Thirdly, when she inquires about whether a different formulation of words or section or subsection would render it open, such a motion, to a different judgment on the same question convention, I hope she'll understand when I say I can't possibly pronounce upon that until I know the circumstances. I would have to see the particulars, and I'm grateful for the rather vigorous nodding of the head of the Right Honourable Gentleman Member for Wokingham, who at least on that point seems to agree with me. Point of order, Mr. David T.C. Davis.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. In citing your ruling just now, you spoke of the importance of precedent and convention. And yet earlier on this year, when you allowed a motion that everyone thought was unamendable to be amended, you said, sir, I'm not in the business of invoking precedent, nor am I under any obligation to do so. If we were guided only by precedent, nothing would ever change. Yeah. Can you understand, sir, in the light of your comments, why some people perceive, perhaps incorrectly, that the only consistency one can find in your rulings is that they always seem to favour one side of the argument and never the government, who are trying their best to carry out the mandate given to them by the British people in 2016?
Well, to the honourable gentleman, and I mean this very sincerely for his point of order, and in particular, in the best traditions of the honourable gentleman's parliamentary service, for his explicit, direct challenge. I respect that. No whispering behind his hands or muttering into his soup or anything like that. He's challenging me directly. I don't agree with him. I think the consistent thread is that I try to do what I think is right by the House of Commons, including by, in many cases, minorities whose voices need to be heard. What I said when I allowed the amendment in the name of the Right Honourable and learned gentleman, the member for Beaconsfield, on, if memory serves me correctly, the 9th of January this year, was that the will of the House should be tested. It may well be that it had not been the norm for such motions to be amended, but I felt the circumstances were different. Very specifically, I sensed that there was a very strong appetite for that amendment amongst several parties in the House and a resistance to it by a very much smaller number of parties. And I thought the will of the House should be tested. It is true that we are guided not only by precedent, but what I would say to the honourable gentleman is that just because we're not guided only by precedent doesn't mean that we're not guided at all by precedent. What one has to do is to make a balanced judgment about what best serves the interests of the House. And all I would say to the honourable gentleman is that as recently as Saturday, at the insistence of the government, and I think with the support of the House met on Saturday to deliberate on this very matter. Simply to allow the matter to be reconsidered 2 days later and the very next sitting day seems to me to be entirely unreasonable, and nothing that I have said by way of conclusion today flies in the face of contrary expert advice that I have received. I have consulted, I have taken advice, I have listened to people expert in these matters, and I have not been counselled that what I have said today is wrong. I have not been counselled that what I have said today is wrong, and I have a very strong sense that there is a pretty wide acceptance that on this matter, my judgment, however inconvenient and irksome to some people, has the advantage of being procedurally right. Point of order, Mr. Robert Halfon.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I respect your judgment, and I share your love of precedent, but given what you have said, and given that there have already been a number of votes in this House for a second referendum and voted against, will you apply the same precedent about having repetitive votes when you consider in your deliberations if amendments are put forward for a second referendum?
To the honourable gentleman for what he said, and the principle that I have enunciated has wider application. We are in a new session. The same question convention applies to consideration of the same matter in the same session. I very gently say to the right honourable gentleman that we are in a new session, a point that is in fact so blindingly obvious that I'm sure it won't have escaped the right honourable gentleman, who is a very clever fellow, for a moment. Yes, indeed. Point of order, Dr. Caroline Johnson.
Some of my constituents have written to me today concerned that the reason that the vote has not been allowed is because the result would go in the government's favour. Now, I'm sure that I've heard that you've given reason for it. But on Saturday, the amendment was brought forward by a right honourable member, member for West Dorset. He has said himself that were the bill to be brought forward, the vote to be brought forward now, that he would not amend it again, and that he would support the government's legislation to come forward. So is there not a sign that actually something has changed since Saturday?
The answer to that, I don't recall every single word that the right honourable gentleman member for West Dorset has said, though I am familiar with the thrust of his argumentation on these matters. It is a matter of record that the right honourable gentleman member for West Dorset has voted for the withdrawal agreement 3 times, and it is a matter of record that he has expressed support for the government's latest deal with the European Union, causing him, therefore, to be inclined to vote for the legislation. The right honourable gentleman can vote for the legislation if he wishes, and I have every expectation on the strength of what he said that he will do so. But the right honourable gentleman doesn't determine what the judgment is about the same question convention. I mean, he could if he were the Speaker of the House, and if the honourable lady is going to make a belated attempt to persuade the right honourable gentleman to abandon his retirement plans and to seek election to the chair, she may have success with him or she may not. I don't know. He doesn't seem to be offering me any encouragement in that matter. But I've made the judgment I've made, and I think it's the right judgment to make. Point of order, Mr. Geraint Davis.
Point of order. Her Majesty the Queen thought she had 5 weeks to write her Queen's speech, but then she was just given a few days, and she's waiting intently to know what the response of the House is on the Queen's speech. But instead, the Leader of the House has put down a motion which is basically a copycat of the motion on Saturday in breach of Erskine May, and predictably, I've got to say, Mr. Speaker, you ruled it out of order. Isn't this a discourtesy to Her Majesty and reason that the Leader should reconsider his position for his own incompetence?
Well, I'm very grateful to the honourable gentleman, but I don't think we should get ahead of ourselves. I certainly am not accusing the Leader of discourtesy. I'm not doing so at all. In fact, I celebrated his unfailing courtesy to me, and I think he will acknowledge mine to him. We are going to hear from the Leader of the House with the business statement, and if the honourable gentleman wants to question the Leader of the House on that business statement and to express his indignation, I very much doubt any force on earth will stop him doing so. If that exhausts the appetite for now of colleagues to raise points of order, and I'm very grateful to colleagues for what they've said and for the courtesy with which they've expressed themselves, whether they agree with my ruling or not. We come now to the first of our urgent questions. Urgent question, the Leader of the Opposition, Jeremy Corbyn.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to ask an urgent question, namely to ask the Prime Minister to make a statement on the publication of the European Union Withdrawal Agreement Bill and his letter of the 19th of October to the European Council seeking an extension to the period provided under Article 50.
The Secretary of State for Exiting the European Union, Secretary Stephen Barclay.
Mr. Speaker, notice of the Withdrawal Agreement Bill was given to the House on Saturday. The bill was handed to the House yesterday as agreed with the House authorities. It will be introduced for first reading at the start of main business today. The publication of the Withdrawal Agreement Bill is therefore now being delayed by the Leader of the Opposition because he has tabled an urgent question requesting the publication of the Withdrawal Agreement Bill. Genius. The Withdrawal Agreement Bill cannot, Mr. Speaker, be finalised until the European Council on Thursday the 17th of October, and then follows a historic meeting of this House on Saturday the 19th of October. It has then been introduced on the following sitting day, and as you said just a moment ago, Mr. Speaker, in response to a point of order, what could be shorter than the next sitting day? The sooner this urgent question and the next urgent question are concluded, the sooner it will be available to members. In respect to the Prime Minister's letter to President Tusk of the 19th of October, this was sent in compliance with Section 1 of the Benn Act. The President of the European Council has accepted the request as valid and indicated he is considering it and consulting with Member States.
Jeremy Corbyn.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I do admire the Secretary of State for keeping a straight face while he gave that answer. And I'm very grateful to this. I'm very grateful to this urgent question being granted, Mr. Speaker. The Prime Minister has not deigned to grace us with his presence today, but I'm reassured, Mr. Speaker, that despite his pledge, he's not to be found anywhere in a ditch. I would, however, like to welcome the fact that the Prime Minister has sent a letter over the weekend to the EU President Donald Tusk to comply with the EU Withdrawal No. 2 Act. Mr. Speaker, as we've come to expect with this Prime Minister, this has been done with posturing and attempts to distract. But despite having told the British public over and over again he would never do it, the letter has, in fact, been sent. Yeah. The request is not only legally necessary and prevents us crashing out of the EU with no deal, but the extension allows this House the space to scrutinise the Prime Minister's Brexit deal. I want to pay tribute to all those members who have worked hard to ensure a no-deal Brexit is ruled out, and I will continue to work across the House to ensure that this continues to be the case. Mr. Speaker, the European Commission has confirmed today that Brussels is now considering the terms of an extension. Can the Secretary of State tell the House when he expects any extension to be granted? And can he categorically rule out the absolutely ridiculous reports yesterday that Conservative MPs are trying to amend the law to jail members of Parliament alleged to have colluded with foreign powers? Does he, like me, fear that for the honourable member for Shrewsbury and Atcham, who is telling everyone who will listen that he is trying to collude with the Polish and Hungarian governments to veto any possibility of Article 50 extensions? Mr. Speaker, this type of nonsense is doing nobody any good at all. If the Prime Minister wants to get his deal through, he should bring forward the Withdrawal Agreement Bill for scrutiny. Will he also bring forward an economic impact assessment?
Yes, that would be good.
Which has so far not seen the light of day. And will he allow this House ample time to scrutinise what this deal means to the communities that we all represent?
Well, I can tell the House what has been ditched, and it is the honourable gentleman's manifesto, which he has ditched from the commitment he gave to respect the referendum result to one which is now characterised by dither and delay. He says that he questions the letter from the Prime Minister. What the Prime Minister made clear is that we would abide by the law. And what Lord Pannick has confirmed, amongst many others, is that the Prime Minister has done so. So there is no question as to the commitment from the Prime Minister, but of course he disagrees with the action, and it won't surprise any members either of this House or of the European Council as to what the position of the Prime Minister is and his commitment to leaving on the 31st of October. The honourable gentleman talks about collusion. We in this House, Mr. Speaker, want to collude with the British public to respect the referendum result and to get Brexit done. And when he talks about delay, he should answer this question. If he wants a second referendum, we know the Shadow Brexit Secretary wants a second referendum, but if he wants a second referendum, how long is that going to take? How long will the primary legislation take? How long will the Electoral Commission requirements take? How long is he going to leave the House in purgatory? He gave a commitment that if we went past the 31st of October, there would be a general election. And yet on the Moore programme on Sunday, the Shadow Brexit Secretary said he wanted further delay in order to have a second referendum. So when is he going to accept the Prime Minister's challenge? When is he going to have a general election? Or are we going to have, as the Shadow Brexit Secretary said, more dither, more delay and more shirking of his responsibilities?
Mr. Kenneth Clark.
Mr. Speaker, could my right honourable friend try to ensure the government stops giving this sort of sacred quality to the date of October the 31st, which is a really rather silly point, which has intruded into the extremely complicated arguments we're having on this whole issue, although I personally would be quite happy if we could conclude a withdrawal agreement along the lines the Prime Minister is proposing by 31st of October, if we could do it properly. But the date was not selected by the British public or the British government. It was a compromise in the EU between President Macron and the rest and was plucked out of the air. So will he agree with me that what matters is we get the right withdrawal agreement carried with the tenuous majority the government may have through second reading and third reading so its form is actually settled, and then we can proceed in a way which future generations, if we get it right or if we get it wrong, will regard as much more important than whether we actually made it for a particular day in October 2019.
But the reality, Mr. Speaker, is the date was set by the previous European Council, and it is not a unilateral decision for the UK Parliament as to whether that date is changed. Now, previously in this House, the Father of the House has said what mattered was avoiding no deal. The Prime Minister has secured a deal that does that. So what matters now is that we end the uncertainty for businesses, the uncertainty for citizens, and actually deliver on the deal the Prime Minister has negotiated, one agreed by the EU 27 as well, and we get Brexit done.
Mr. Ian Blackbird.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and can I congratulate the Leader of the Opposition for lodging this question. But of course, it's a question to the Prime Minister. And it's a question about the Prime Minister's behaviour. Where is he? Where is the respect that the Prime Minister is showing to this House? Mr. Speaker, the Prime Minister is utterly humiliated by his defeat on Saturday. A defeat that saw this House reject his unfair anti-democratic deal. A defeat, Mr. Speaker, that has forced the Prime Minister to send a letter to the European Union Council requesting a deal. But what did the Prime Minister do? He sent a letter, not on headed paper, and unsigned.
Pathetic.
Can I ask if the Prime Minister is used to sending unsigned letters in his capacity as Prime Minister, and if so, how many? And I want a direct answer to that question.
Anonymous letters.
But I think we know the answer. Because his behaviour lacks dignity. It lacks respect. It is not becoming of any Prime Minister. Once again, the Prime Minister has shown himself to be unworthy of the office he holds. Mr. Speaker, I have with me a copy of a joint letter sent from the First Ministers of Scotland and Wales to President Tusk. Properly addressed, with their official letterheads, and duly signed. The Prime Minister should take note. That is a lesson on how to behave. Because his actions don't just show disrespect to this House, but to the court in Scotland, but to President Tusk himself. Despite the Prime Minister's childish games of sending a contrary letter, of course, the SNP is pleased to see that the grown-ups in room, namely the European Council, are now considering the extension. An extension that must be secured to protect our interests from the economic oblivion if we were to exit the European Union on a no-deal Brexit. Mr. Speaker, I join with the Leader of the Opposition to express the SNP's outrage that the Prime Minister has instructed his government to publish the withdrawal bill without securing adequate time for parliamentary debate and scrutiny. Once again, this Conservative government is showing disregard for democracy. It is absolutely imperative that representatives here are able to do our jobs and scrutinise the legislation given the magnitude of the implications. So I say to the Prime Minister, through the Secretary that's here, if he's not afraid of democratic debate, secure the extension and let's give the time for full scrutiny of the bill. And let me ask this. If he's so sure that the people are with him, will he confirm today that he will seek support for this bill from the Scottish Parliament, who must give consent first?
Well, the crux of the issue is the Prime Minister has complied with the law. But it is right that alongside that he sets out his well-known views, and that should not come as a surprise to the right honourable gentleman any more than it should to any other member of this House. But what is unworthy, Mr. Speaker, is to have referendums and to ignore the result, which is a position of the right honourable gentleman not just in terms of the referendum in 2014, but also in terms of the referendum in 2016. After more than 1,200 days since the referendum, the one thing I don't think this House has lacked is opportunity to debate the issues contained in the withdrawal agreement bill. And the withdrawal bill will be published, it is with the House, in order for that debate to happen. So it's time for the House to get on to that debate, to back the bill, to get Brexit done, and to get on to the domestic priorities, the record investment in our health service, the extra 20,000 police officers that we're recruiting, and levelling up all parts of the United Kingdom as part of a strong economic delivery.
Sir John Redwood.
I'm glad the government wishes to base our future relationship with the EU on comprehensive free trade agreement. So will the government get on and table one and show urgency in trying to get one? Because the sooner we can get one, the more reassuring it will be in Northern Ireland. And the public, who are heartily sick of all this, don't want to waste another 15 months. And Mr. Speaker, may I personally thank you for avoiding Groundhog Day today. I heard all the arguments on Saturday. I don't think I need to hear them again.
Well, I agree with my right honourable friend. We need to get on to the future relationship. The House has been debating endlessly the winding down provisions, which is what is contained in the withdrawal agreement bill. And what the political declaration sets out is a clear framework for a best-in-class free trade agreement, and we need to pass the bill in order to get on to doing that.
Jay Swinson.
Mr. Speaker, the Prime Minister was withering in his criticism of the first Brexit deal, and yet he voted for it. He said that no Conservative PM should ever accept a border down the Irish Sea. and yet he has. And he said he would never ask for an extension of Article 50, and yet he sent the letter doing just that. If the Prime Minister is allowed to change his mind, surely the government should give the public the opportunity to do the same by putting their Brexit deal to a people's vote.
I think it's somewhat ironic to have a question about changing minds from the Liberal Democrats, who were the first party to call for an in-out referendum and who now want a people's vote on the basis of ignoring the people's vote that we've had.
Sir William Cash.
Mr. Speaker, the urgent question was introduced by the Leader of the Opposition, which is somewhat unusual. May I refer my right honourable friend to a bill which was introduced in 1997 in the name of the Leader of the Opposition with the Right Honourable Tony Benn, which says that the sections 2 and 3 of the European Communities Act 1972 are hereby repealed, that the European Court of Justice shall have no effect in the United Kingdom, and would he also recall the number of times, which, as far as I'm concerned, was indefinite, when the Right Honourable Leader of the Opposition went through the lobby with me on every single occasion relating to European matters? Does he accept that this really does demonstrate a monumental, not only a mere U-turn, but a monumental degree of lack of memory and a lack of understanding of what the withdrawal bill is all about and the referendum itself?
Well, my right honourable friend has always stuck to his principles. The reality is the Leader of the Opposition cannot even stick to his own manifesto.
Angela Eagle.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Doesn't the Brexit Secretary agree with me that the Prime Minister has a problem with veracity? He told us that he would rather be dead in a ditch than sign the letter and sign the letter. He told us that there would be no border in the Irish Sea, and then he negotiated a border in the Irish Sea. Why on earth should we ever believe a single thing that this Prime Minister says?
Well, the Prime Minister didn't sign the letter, so I think the issue with veracity was actually in the question.
Mr. John Whittingdale.
Would my right friend agree that what the recipients of the letter and other EU member states, and indeed the country, want to know is whether or not the agreement that they have reached with the Prime Minister commands the majority support of this House? And how does he propose to explain to them that now, on a second day of the House of Commons meeting, we are still unable to discover that?
I very much share my right honourable friend's frustration. That exactly is the question that will be posed in capitals. They have reached a deal with the government. They want to see the UK leave in a smooth and orderly way. That is what their citizens want to see, is what UK citizens in Europe want to happen, and the sooner we get on and do it, the better.
Mr. Hilary Benn.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. It's reported that the Secretary of State this morning told the House of Lords Select Committee that under this agreement, goods leaving Northern Ireland for the rest of the United Kingdom will require an exit summary declaration to be submitted. Can he confirm for the House that such declarations have to be made when goods leave the customs territory of the European Union? If so, how does that square with Article 4 of the Protocol, which says that Northern Ireland is part of the customs territory of the United Kingdom? It's either part of the European Union or the United Kingdom. It can't be both.
Well, what I was referring to in those remarks was in line with international obligations. Some practical information will be needed to be provided electronically on the movement of goods from west to east. However, the government will be considering the process during the implementation period.
Craig McKinley.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I just say on the floor of this House now, I have zero and absolutely no respect for the Ben Surrender Act. I have no respect by the means by which it was brought to the House and the order paper was taken over. I have no respect that it had 4 hours debate with 1 day's notice. I have no respect. Now, Mr. Speaker, you were not in the chair that afternoon, but the manner in which manuscript amendments were being debated before they were available, this was a shambolic act brought by those who do not want to respect Brexit. The government should be in control of the order paper, and if others don't want that, they can lay a vote of no confidence that they will not do. I really wonder, Mr. Speaker, what is this urgent question for? Is it an argument that somehow the government should have delivered a letter that was gold-trimmed on a sort of a sequined velvet cushion to the Commission? Can the Secretary of State confirm that the letter has obviously been treated as genuine and is being dealt with in the appropriate way by the Council of Ministers, much as I would have preferred that the government and the Prime Minister had ignored this shambolic Ben Act?
Well, the Ben legislation, as he well knows, was designed to prevent a no-deal exit. The Prime Minister was told that changing the backstop was impossible. He delivered it. He was told the withdrawal agreement text couldn't be changed. He did so. We now have a deal that the House can pass. I hope members across the House will do so with the withdrawal agreement bill in order that we can leave on the 31st of October, as citizens and businesses around the country want us to do, and to get on with it.
Mr. Barry Chairman.
Mr. Speaker, I hope the Minister realises that I could never get angry with him. He's always been, he and I have always had very good relationships, and I trust him a very long way. But can I ask you, can I beg him to talk to the Prime Minister about this whole sort of, it's almost a philosophy of get on with it. You know, we must get this done, get on with it. Would he agree with me? It's our sacred duty, not just to get on with it, to make sure what the deal is, the quality of it, actually serves our constituents, because they depend on us for their health, their welfare, their future, their prosperity. So we must take this business seriously and slowly. Get on with it is a nasty jibe. Stop it.
Well, firstly, can I thank the honourable gentleman for the kind words with which he prefaced his question, and I very much have always enjoyed working with him on that basis. In terms of the detail, he's right. We do need to get that detail right. But we also need to be clear as to what the scope of the withdrawal agreement bill is. It is to implement the deal, the international treaty that has been reached. It is not to determine the future relationship, which the House, through the withdrawal agreement bill, will have a lot of opportunity in terms of the negotiation mandate to discuss and get right. So we need to implement the treaty. We need to do that through what has been agreed with the EU in the form of the withdrawal agreement bill, and then get on to the debates which I look forward to having with him on the terms of the free trade agreement as we move forward with that deal.
Ben Bradley.
I wonder if my honourable friend shares my concern that two members of opposition frontbench parties now have said it's not good enough simply to police the Prime Minister's actions through the courts. They now also want to police his thoughts and opinions as well. I think that's quite a sinister preview of what life might be like under a Labour government if it were to happen. Can he confirm my understanding of the process for the following week and the legislation, and perhaps for my constituents' clarity, that if members opposite bring forward amendments that are not compatible with the agreement that we've made with the European Union, all that will achieve is not to have the outcome of those amendments, it will just frustrate and prevent us from passing a deal and leaving on time?
Well, on the detail in terms of the next steps, my right honourable friend, the Leader of the House, will make a business statement after the urgent questions, and I would not want to preempt that. But on the wider point, he's absolutely right. The Prime Minister has met his legal obligation. That has been recognised by the President of the European Court, the European Union. And what we now need to do is implement the withdrawal agreement bill, get Brexit done, and get on to the free trade agreement, which the honourable gentleman referred to earlier.
Jerry.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I welcome the fact that despite all the malarkey and green ink letters and spin on Saturday night, the European Union have accepted the request for an extension. But does it concern the Secretary of State that in the court action raised in Scotland, in which I acknowledge the support of Dale Vince, despite the fact that the Prime Minister the Attorney-General and the Advocate-General have all assured the Court that the Prime Minister will obey the Benn Act and asked the Court to dismiss the action. Despite those promises and assurances, the Court have seen fit to continue the action to make sure that the Prime Minister keeps his promise.
Well, it's not for a Minister of the Crown to comment on any live court proceedings, but to follow the lexicon of the Honourable Lady, what would be malarkey is for claimants to send letters before the publication of the correspondence that address the issue that was sought in the earlier judgment.
Neil O'Brien.
Recently returned to the House after 2 weeks paternity leave following the birth of my thank you very much. Following the birth of my son, my beautiful son Arthur. I've returned to find even better the Prime Minister secured a wonderful Brexit deal, which I look forward to voting.
Name. You want to know the name of the child?
Arthur, Mr. Speaker. Can my right honourable friend reassure me that he will now crack on and get the legislation through so that we can get Brexit done and not be still talking about this when Arthur is old enough to drive?
Let me be the first to congratulate the honourable gentleman on the birth of Arthur, and we wish him a long and happy and healthy life. And I had noticed the absence of the honourable gentleman, and it's very good to welcome him back to the chamber. Secretary of State.
Well, there may have been delays in getting Brexit delivered, but I'm delighted that Arthur has been delivered, and I'm sure I speak for the whole House in both offering our congratulations and also wishing Arthur every success for the future. He's absolutely right. I think up and down the country there is huge frustration both amongst our constituents but also with businesses that want an end to the uncertainty, want to see a deal reached, recognise it's in the country's interest to leave in a smooth and orderly way, and see that the Prime Minister has agreed a deal that is brought to the House. It's now for the House to pass the legislation to enable us to move forward and to get on to the other priorities we want to do.
Ian Murray.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I have received thousands of emails since the Prime Minister brought back his deal on Thursday from constituents who are asking me to tell them what the impact of this deal will be on their jobs, livelihoods and future prosperity for the communities in which they live. I'm unable to do so because the government are refusing to publish an economic impact assessment. What is the answer to them? Will GDP go down? Will jobs and unemployment go up? What is the answer?
Well, the answer is to listen to the Bank of England governor, who says that getting this deal passed will be a boost to our economy, because there's a huge amount of investment ready to be released into the economy if we get this deal passed. The voices of business up and down the country want a decision, want the UK to move forward in a smooth and orderly way, and the best way of addressing the concerns of his constituents is to get Brexit done.
Ollie Elphick. Mr. Speaker, at the Dover front line, we have long been ready for any eventuality, deal or no deal, to leave the European Union. But what we now need is certainty, because uncertainty, and it's dragging on, is becoming economically damaging. So has he had any representations from party opposite about how they'll assist with getting on with Brexit, or has he only ever heard, as I have heard, that they simply want to cancel Brexit and defy the British people?
I absolutely agree with my honourable friend that what we need is certainty, and what the Prime Minister's deal offers is exactly that. And what we have from the benches opposite is more dither, more delay, a desire for a second referendum, and yet no clarity as to how long that second referendum would take.
Ms. Leslie.
I understand the Minister's political reasons for the reluctance around the Benn Act, but it is the law of the land. And it's important, because I'm worried from what he's said, that he seems to give the impression it's only about sending a letter. It's more than that. Section 1, subsection 4 of the Benn Act requires that the Prime Minister, quote, must seek to obtain an extension. So it's not just a matter of sending a letter. He must seek to obtain that extension. And that involves using the Prime Minister's best endeavours, his good faith, in trying to... There's a duty on the Prime Minister, Mr. Speaker, that he must seek to obtain an extension. So will the Minister acknowledge that the legal duties on the Prime Minister and not simply about sending an unsigned letter.
Well said.
I mean, the reality is this is Parliament's letter, and the Prime Minister has sent Parliament's letter. But he's been clear that he will comply with the law. He has complied with the law. That is reflected in the comments of figures such as Lord Panic. But he is also entitled to express his views, and that's exactly what he's done.
Andrew Percy.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I say that lots of my constituents in East Yorkshire and North Lincolnshire think that what happened on Saturday was a Westminster bubble, smarty-pants little stitch-up to stop us leaving the European Union on October 31st. And you know what, Mr. Speaker? That's exactly what it was. And can I say to him, the reason why October the 31st is so important is because so many people in this country, particularly across the north of England, have figured out what's going on in here. There is an attempt to play for time, to delay, delay and delay, with the one and simple aim, which is to overturn the referendum result that people in here never accepted and never had any intention of accepting.
Well, my honourable friend is absolutely right. The House said that it didn't believe the Prime Minister would get a deal. He did get a deal. They said they wanted a meaningful vote. Then when the opportunity is presented to have a meaningful vote, they make it meaningless. It's time for those games to stop, for us to get a deal through, and the opportunity to do so is to support the withdrawal agreement bill that legislates on the deal the Prime Minister has reached.
Catherine McKinnell.
Speaker, the Chancellor has responded to the Treasury Select Committee's request of 3 months ago asking for updated economic analysis of the free trade agreement that the government is pursuing. The Chancellor has acknowledged that the current economic analysis does not correspond with previous analysis produced by the government, but has not indicated any commitment to provide updated economic analysis. He appears to think it's acceptable for MPs to vote blindly on a potential free trade agreement. Either he has something to hide, or he thinks that's an acceptable way for MPs to be left in the dark.
Well, the reality is the House will have lots of opportunities to debate and instruct in terms of the negotiating mandate, how those negotiations are taken forward. I mean, the reality is that any modelling for the future would have to take on board what is the future direction of the Commission under the new leadership. It would have to consider what actions the UK government would take in response. It'd have to model what would happen elsewhere in the world, for example, in terms of China and the US. So the reality is one can't do a forecast on these things, but it's right that the House will have an opportunity to negotiate these and to discuss these as part of shaping the mandate for the future.
Peter Bone.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I think the Leader of the Opposition was slightly wrong in his question when he said the letter takes no deal off the table. That's impossible, because it's up to the other nations of the European Union whether they grant an extension or not. The only way, sir, you can definitely take no deal off the table is, as someone else once said, is vote for this deal, and that's exactly what this House should do. Does the Secretary of State agree?
I very much agree with my honourable friend, and I'm grateful to him for his support for the deal. And the reality is, as he says, this is Parliament's letter, but any extension would require the agreement of all 27 member states, and that is something that is outside of Parliament's control.
I'm not quite sure from her expression whether the Right Honourable Lady, the member from Maidenhead, is welcoming the Honourable Gentleman's belated support or regretting the fact that it wasn't on offer at a rather earlier stage. Both. Thank you. Mr. Stephen Doughty.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. One of the reasons why I believe that the government wanted to try and bounce us on Saturday and wanted to bounce us again was actually to hide some of the content and some of the revelations that will come out in the bill, which we will see published shortly. And I think there will be great concerns, not only on this side of the House, but indeed from others who take a very different position from me on Brexit. But I want to take the Secretary of State back to the question that my right honourable friend, who's now not in his place, the chair of the committee, asked about customs declarations, export declarations between Northern Ireland and the UK. Will he confirm that what he said to Lord Wood in the other place was that export declaration paperwork would to carry out, and therefore, essentially, firms in Northern Ireland will be having to carry out paperwork, and whether digital or otherwise, to trade within their own country, within the United Kingdom. And will he also confirm whether that will apply going back in the opposite direction or not?
As I said in response to the earlier question, I'm very happy to confirm that it is the case that in respect of some international obligations, then there will be occasions where information is needed electronically for the movement of goods, and that is in accordance with international obligations. But the reality is, he talks about bouncing decision-making. We've already had 2 extensions. The House has debated these issues endlessly. The withdrawal agreement, the first version of the withdrawal agreement, was published as long ago as last November. The reality is he doesn't want any Brexit. He wants a second referendum. He wants to remain, and he will do everything he can to frustrate Brexit happening.
Mr. Robert Halfon.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Can we write another letter to the European Union saying that we utterly oppose having a second referendum? And does my right honourable friend not agree that a second referendum is a betrayal of many thousands of Harlow voters who voted to leave and millions of working people across the country? We should respect democracy and implement the result of 2016.
Well, I absolutely agree with my honourable friend. A second referendum would simply take us back to square one. It would create huge uncertainty, huge delay, and prolong the paralysis of this Parliament when we need a general election and to let the people decide.
Justin Matters.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I want to return to the issue of the economic impact assessment, because the effect of all this on manufacturing in my constituency in particular is absolutely critical. So I don't know whether the government are unwilling or unable to release any information they've got on this, but surely the Minister can see how important it is that we have all this information before we make any decisions. After all, he wouldn't buy a house without looking at the deeds, would he?
But the point that is missing is the free trade agreement is still to be negotiated, and what is causing damage to businesses in his constituency and elsewhere is reflected in, for example, the comments of people like Lord Rose, who was a leader of the Remain campaign, who now recognises that what is damaging to business is the ongoing uncertainty. We need to bring that uncertainty to an end, and it is his continued refusal to vote both for a deal whilst also opposing no deal, which is prolonging the uncertainty and damaging the interests of businesses in his constituency.
Mr. Speaker, I don't know if you stayed tuned to the Andrew Marr show after watching Match of the Day yesterday morning, but if you did, you'd have heard the Right Honourable Member for Esher and Walton say that Parliament cannot muzzle the Prime Minister. He doesn't want an extension. He should be at liberty to tell the EU that. Does my Right Honourable friend agree?
I very much agree. I don't think it will come as a surprise to colleagues in Europe as to what the view of the Prime Minister is. He has been clear from day one that he wanted a deal, despite many voices in this House suggesting otherwise, and he's been clear that it's in the country's interest to leave on the 31st of October. That remains his commitment, and that is exactly what the government is committed to doing.
I think the honourable gentleman was referring to a show at 9 o'clock on Sunday morning. Yes, I do periodically watch that programme. It isn't sort of top of my list of priorities, but occasionally I will observe it. But I'm bound to say it was a rather greater priority yesterday morning at 9 o'clock to be playing tennis. Very wise. Mr. Peter Grant.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As well as the unsigned letter that the Prime Minister refused even to grace with his name, he sent another letter which he signed in his own name, effectively saying, "Dear Donald, please ignore the first letter I've sent you. I only sent it to comply with an Act of Parliament." If it was not the purpose of that second letter to deliberately attempt to frustrate an Act of this Parliament, what on earth was the second letter for?
Well, as I have said in response to several questions now, Mr. Speaker, the Prime Minister is entitled to express his view. That should not come as a surprise to the honourable gentleman. He has complied with the law. Leading legal figures such as Lord Pannick accept that he has complied with the law, but in addition he has set out his view as he's entitled to do.
Which side is it now? Mr. Ian Duncan-Smith.
Speaker, I hadn't planned standing and just wanted to make a clear point that match of the day every time trumps anything else, frankly, as far as I'm concerned. But I would want to say to my right honourable friend that can he just explain to me, as it is now finally it appears to be the opposition's position, although I'm never quite clear whether that will change next week, that they want to have a second referendum. could he then explain to me what could anybody say to the British public when they go out and say, we didn't trust you last time, now you have to trust us that we will trust you again on a second referendum? How could they possibly believe or trust British politicians?
I must tell the right honourable gentleman for Chingford and Woodford Green that he shares that penchant with the late and great Anthony Crossland, who greatly enjoyed watching Match of the Day. He would often have colleagues around the dinner table in his home, and they would be discussing political matters. But moments before Match of the Day, Crossland would make it very clear that all further political discussion must cease as he proposed to watch the programme, and he would usually don a bobble hat whilst doing so. Secretary of State.
Mr. Speaker, perhaps we could have a similar tradition for the remaining duration of the Rugby World Cup, which I'm sure across the House many members would also enjoy applying that maxim to. My honourable friend is absolutely correct in terms of, well, firstly, the position of the opposition. I appreciate it has moved rather a lot and rather frequently. But if I take the position set out by the Shadow Brexit Secretary on Sunday, it clearly was for a second referendum. And that is odd, given that they don't trust the people with the first referendum. But the question the Leader of the Opposition isn't answering and needs to answer is, how long does he expect the primary legislation to take? How long does he expect the question testing from the Electoral Commission? How long does he expect the operational preparations to take? And how long does he expect the regulated campaign period to be for? Now, if his position is to have a second referendum, we need answers to those questions, because he risks leaving this Parliament in paralysis because he's not answering how long he wants to delay Brexit for.
Martin Whitfield.
Grateful, Mr. Speaker. Just to clarify a statement that the Secretary of State made earlier about the Bank of England, they were, of course, comparing the current withdrawal agreement to a no-deal rather than the current economy. But to answer my young constituents, could the Secretary of State say whether he has ever sent a letter that he has not had the courtesy to sign?
No.
As I think with all MPs, there are occasions, for example, that I have dictated letters to my parliamentary office, and they have taken as dictated and signed on my behalf.
Jonathan Edwards.
Diolch fawr iawn, Mr. Speaker. When you mentioned your activities at 9 o'clock yesterday morning, I was rather hoping that you'd say that the pressing engagement was a very famous Welsh rugby victory in the quarter-final of the World Cup. Slightly fortunate, but a very famous victory nonetheless. When it comes to the more complicated matter of the future trade relations, every single member state of the European Union, including some constituent parts, such as Wallonia in Belgium, will have to endorse the final FTA. The withdrawal agreement and the political declaration makes no mention of the British government having to seek the consent of the Senedd in Cardiff, or indeed the Scottish Parliament. So why is it, therefore, as things stands, will Wallonia, a constituent part of the Belgian state, have more influence over the future FTA with the EU than Wales and Scotland?
The Honourable raises an important point, actually, as to how, as we take forward the negotiations, we engage with the devolved assemblies. It is a very fair point. It is one we're very keen to address, and I also to recognise that there have been concerns, particularly in terms of the first phase, as to the effectiveness of the JMC in terms of those discussions. One of the things within my own department I changed was to ask officials to engage at official level much more. The Chancellor of the Duchy of Lancaster, I know, spoke with both the Scottish and Welsh governments in the last day or so. They also, along with the Minister of State within my department, went up to Edinburgh for those meetings. But he raises a very fair point, and it is one that I'm very keen to work with him on.
Sweeney.
Mr. Speaker, Parliament voted by acclamation on Saturday to, in effect, pass the withdrawal agreement as amended on that motion. So will the Minister now confirm that when the withdrawal agreement bill comes before the House at the various stages of the bill, that the Government will respect if this House does decide to amend it in certain different ways? And we've seen, obviously, a commitment by the Government before to respect the indicative votes. If we see a majority emerge in this House for amendments to that bill, will the Government respect it?
The Honourable Gentleman will get an opportunity to see the withdrawal agreement bill once the two UQs are finished. And in terms of amendments, clearly he'll be aware that the scope of the bill is quite wide, but it will always be for the Chair, the Speaker, or indeed the Chairman of Ways and Means in terms of what amendments are selected.
Geraint Davis.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Secretary of State has pretended that the government is unable to make economic forecasts of a new Brexit deal on the basis that things may change in the Commission or in the world economic environment. But it is the case, of course, that the Treasury consistently makes forecasts on what the size of the economy would be relative to what it would be if we stayed in the EU versus various scenarios. So clearly what he's saying is false. And what is the case is that projection is approximately a 5% reduction in the size of our economy. When will the Treasury and the government come forward with a detailed analysis of how much poorer the poorest will be, how much more corporation tax businesses will have to pay when they're facing a huge burden of red tape, how will the public accounts be faced, and what will be the impact, so that people can judge what's on the plate, having ordered on the menu, and then vote again in a people's vote, so they get what they order on the menu rather than his garbage.
What I was pointing to is just an economic reality, is that one can set out, and the Treasury frequently does, broad landing zones, but forecasts are inherently difficult because there are so many variables that shape what happens. And to say with absolute certainty where things will be in 2033, which is where the forecast would be trying to determine a precise landing zone, I think is open to significant challenge, and we saw that not just on these benches when the Treasury presented the Cross-Whitehall analysis last November, but it was also on the benches opposite, the sort of questions he and others were making.
Thank you. Order. Urgent question. Tony Lloyd.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I ask the Secretary of State for Northern Ireland if he'll make a statement on progress to restore devolution in the light of today's decision, extension of the period in which the legal duty to call an Assembly election is removed under Section 2 of the Executive Functions Act of 2019.
Secretary of State for Northern Ireland, Secretary Julian Smith.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The period for executive formation under the terms of the Northern Ireland Act, Executive Formation and Exercise of Functions 2018, is due to expire at the end of today, Monday, the 21st of October. So today I have laid before Parliament a statutory instrument to extend the period for executive formation to 13th of January 2020. That has the effect of ensuring that Northern Ireland departments can continue to make decisions in accordance with the Act in the absence of executive ministers. Colleagues should be clear that the Act only provides guidance to the Northern Ireland Civil Service and is no substitute for everyday political decision-making. In reflecting on hundreds of interactions I have had with public sector workers, voluntary workers and members of the public, this continued absence is a huge disappointment. This extension also delays the legal obligation on me to call an Assembly election, but does not prevent me from calling an Assembly election at any time. The political parties have not reached an agreement to get Stormont back up and running, but extending this legal deadline has no bearing on my continuing efforts to restore the executive. And as a result, from tomorrow, in relation to abortion law in Northern Ireland, Sections 58 and 59 of the Offences Against the Person Act 1861 are repealed, in addition to a moratorium on criminal prosecutions. A new legal framework for lawful access to abortion services in Northern Ireland will be put in place by 31st of March 2020, in line with the 2018 UN CEDAW report. I will be consulting on the new framework very soon. On same-sex marriage and opposite-sex civil partnerships, regulations are to be made no later than 13th of January 2020. There are two key areas we are going to consult on: how to allow for religious same-sex marriage ceremonies, and also the issue of conversion from civil partnership to marriage and vice versa. So we can tailor the regulations appropriately. There will be a short consultation on these two issues before we introduce religious same-sex marriage in Northern Ireland. This will not detract from the regulations by 13th of January 2020, providing for civil same-sex marriages and opposite-sex civil partnerships. This means at the latest, the first civil same-sex marriages will take place on the week of Valentine's Day 2020. We also intend to launch a public consultation on a scheme for payments to victims of Troubles-related incidents in the coming days. I'm also determined to ensure that the government delivers on our commitments to broader legacy issues. I cannot understate, Mr. Speaker, the responsibilities of the Northern Ireland parties to finding an accommodation and ensuring the future of the devolved institutions that form such an essential part of the peace process.
Thank you. Tony Lloyd.
Mr. Speaker, can I begin by thanking you for granting this very important urgent question? Both the quantity and the importance of the issues the Secretary of State has already raised with the House indicates how important it is that we have regular dialogue on Northern Ireland. And let me say to government business managers, that hasn't been forthcoming in the level to which we would expect. But can I ask the Secretary of State a number of very specific questions? Brexit, according to the Chancellor of the Duchy of Lancaster, may still result in the crash-out version. Is the Secretary of State certain that he has already in preparation the necessary legislative changes to bring before this House in the event of that no-deal Brexit? But even if we have Brexit with the deal, is the Secretary of State satisfied that the Northern Ireland Civil Service, under the legislation that exists, have the necessary authority to make the very difficult decisions that they and indeed other agencies may have to make as we move through that Brexit process? And in particular, can he assure the House that the Police Service of Northern Ireland have the resources in the event of any form of civic disturbance? I don't want to emphasise what kind of disturbance there could be, but we may face a period of prolonged public unrest. Does the PSNI have the resources and the capacity to play that role? And will he actually at this stage also rule out, as we've had in the past, any idea that the Army could once again be recommitted into Northern Ireland? Mr. Speaker, the Secretary of State mentioned the important issues of abortion and same-sex marriage. Can he tell the House, if Stormont is to return in the period between now and January the 13th, will he work with Stormont to make sure that we have an acceptable solution, since Stormont will, in the post-April the 1st, have the capacity to alter any such law? Will he make sure that, that the processes involved will be ones that Stormont and his department work together to make sure that we can have safe and legal abortion for the women of Northern Ireland in Northern Ireland, and that same-sex marriage can take place in Northern Ireland? Mr. Speaker, in the event that Stormont doesn't return, the Secretary of State needs to plan now for what will happen on January the 13th. We know how quickly time goes by in the context of Northern Ireland, how quickly time has already gone by, 1,000 days plus since Stormont met. The Secretary of State will face a difficult decision, and I would say to him that direct rule is a very unattractive proposition for many, many reasons. He may have to look at the election option to renew the mandate of a Stormont Assembly that hasn't met for so long. But in any event, will he guarantee that he will work with the government, the Irish government in Dublin, to make sure that strand 2 of the Good Friday Agreement is one that is respected? But, Mr. Speaker, if I can finish on this point, there is unease across the unionist community about the Prime Minister's decision to change the terms under which consent is given by Northern Ireland. The Good Friday Agreement was very clear about the need to take both communities together through any decision-making around important constitutional issues for Northern Ireland. Does the Secretary of State accept the unease of the unionist community? Does he also accept he now has a duty to work hard to regain that trust, a trust actually, frankly, that has been betrayed by the decisions of Conservative MPs who once were unionists and now have abandoned their erstwhile friends?
Secretary of State.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. On the issue of legislation and powers in the case of no deal, I've been very clear, no deal is not a good situation for the United Kingdom, and particularly for Northern Ireland, and I hope now the Prime Minister has secured a deal, we can focus on getting that deal over the line. On the Northern Ireland Civil Service, who I paid tribute to this afternoon, they have been the most dedicated civil servants in pushing forward across a range of areas without political decision-making. I believe they do have some powers and political decision guidance from this bill, but it's inadequate, and we need to get Stormont back up and running in order to ensure that they have the political direction that they need. On PSNI and security, the government has invested a further £20 million, or nearly £20 million, and stands ready to continue to support the PSNI financially. I'm obviously responsible in this role for security. This is a sensitive period with police officers under threat day in, day out. But I am comforted that the PSNI is well resourced and I think is doing an exceptional job. And I will keep that monitored and keep in touch with the honourable gentleman in that regard. On the question of the Army, I don't see that any need for any circumstance for the British Army operating in that way. The PSNI are doing all of the functions along with our security services in an exceptional manner. On abortion and same-sex marriage, there is clearly this concern about how does the Assembly now the law is changing, how does it influence? It can influence, but we need to be clear the law from tomorrow has changed across those two areas, and we will hear the views of the Assembly and we will work with them, but the law from tomorrow has changed. On the issue of Stormont return, and if it doesn't return, the consequences of Stormont not getting back up and running are, I think, too profound to consider. We have to get this institution back up and running. Powers from Westminster will involve working with Dublin, will involve a whole range of issues that we shouldn't be having to address. Those men and women who work so hard for peace in Northern Ireland need and continue to remind us that we have to get Stormont back up and running, and I'll be working, as I've been working over the summer, to get, along with the Irish government, to get this crucial institution running again. On the issue of consent, this protocol has been subject to huge debate over the last few days. We've got to remember that one of the biggest criticisms of the last withdrawal agreement was the fact that it needed more say for Northern Ireland. It will have no impact on the petition of concern, on the day-to-day operation of the Assembly. This is an exceptional matter. It is a reserved matter consulting the Assembly. We will be doing everything we can to ensure we make that clear. I've been speaking to members of the unionist community across the weekend, but we do need to ensure that we now get this deal over the line for the United Kingdom and for Northern Ireland.
Order. Order. Momentarily, we will continue with the exchanges on the urgent question. Nominations closed at 5 o'clock this afternoon for candidates for the post of Chair of the Backbench Business Committee. One nomination has been received. A ballot will therefore not be held. I congratulate, and I hope the House will join me in congratulating the honourable gentleman, the member for Gateshead, Mr Ian Mearns, on his re-election as Chair of the Backbench Business Committee. The assiduity and public-spiritedness of the honourable gentleman are renowned throughout the House. Thank you. 4 nominations were received for the post of Chair of the Treasury Select Committee, and a ballot will be held between 10 a.m. and 1:30 p.m. on the 23rd of October in Committee Room 15. Order. The Chair of the Select Committee, Simon Hoare.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. The people of Northern Ireland clearly want to see Stormont back up and running because they're seeing their health, their education and their welfare suffer. But by making this extension, the Secretary of State has provided a window, Mr Speaker, which could possibly see this House overcome the hurdle which seems insurmountable for the parties in Northern Ireland, and that is to legislate for the Irish Language Act. therefore taking it out of the debate between the principal parties in Northern Ireland, and in my judgment removing the hurdle, which is the roadblock, sorry for mixing my metaphors, to getting Stormont back up and running.
Mr. Speaker, the Irish Language Act is one of a number of issues that are being discussed in the talks process. I'd say again, I think the most important and the best way to resolve these issues is through the Stormont talks, and I will continue to work at pace with the Taoiseach to ensure that we encourage parties to come back together and get back into an executive.
3 statements to follow, so we do need to expedite progress, and Gavin Newlands can lead us in that mission. Mr. Newlands.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Stormont, and more importantly, the people of Northern Ireland have now been without a functioning executive for over 1,000 days. In the Government's report on executive formation, it stated that the UK Government, working closely with the Irish Government, will now intensify its efforts to put compromise solutions to the parties. Mr. Speaker, there are no formal talks between the parties at the moment. Now, I fully accept that the Government cannot bind the hands of the parties involved, but can the Secretary of State tell us, with no current talks, what exactly the Government meant by intensifying efforts, and can he tell us when fresh party talks will take place? The Government's reckless Brexit policy and its agreement with the DUP has severely undermined the delicate balance of relationships that are built and sustained the Good Friday Agreement. But given the breakdown in the Government's relationship with the DUP, does he envisage this will have an impact on efforts to restore the Assembly and Executive? And finally, Mr. Speaker, the Government has confirmed the imposition of direct rule as being considered. This is deeply disappointing. It is clear that devolved decisions are best made by the elected politicians of Northern Ireland, and I urge them to get back round the table and to get back to work.
Mr. Speaker, I have been personally meeting with the parties since taking on this job almost on a weekly basis. But as my honourable friend has acknowledged, this is an issue for the 5 parties, and it is ultimately up to those parties to come together, and both the Irish Government and the British Government stand ready with ideas, with thoughts, in order to make that happen. On the relationship between the Government and the DUP, as you know, my responsibilities, Mr. Speaker, are for all parties and across in Northern Ireland. But I have a good relationship with the DUP. I will continue to support the Union to the very best of my ability, and along with all members of this House. On the issue of direct rule, I couldn't have been clearer that Stormont and local decision-making is my priority and the best way, in my view, for Northern Ireland to move forward.
Yes, Mr. Patterson. Mr. Owen Patterson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I totally sympathise with the Secretary and his predecessor, who time and again come to this chamber, say we want to see the institutions up and running, which we all do. But we see today, with the manner in which the meeting broke up in disarray in less than an hour, the task that faces him. At the same time, Mr. Speaker, we see outcomes of public services in Northern Ireland falling behind the rest of the UK, and we all in this chamber have a responsibility to all citizens across the UK. And I just wonder, the Shadow Secretary said quite rightly, direct rule is the most unattractive option. But we do have a responsibility to see good services delivered, and I just wonder what steps the Secretary of State is taking to possibly prepare to take more power into his own hands to ensure that the citizens of Northern Ireland get the services they deserve.
Mr. Speaker, we are prepared for all eventualities, but on the issue of all-party talks, I genuinely believe that whether it's Sinn Féin, whether it's the DUP, we are not too far away, and we have to do everything we can to encourage parties to come together in the best interests of Northern Ireland and to secure an executive.
Looking at the number of colleagues wanting to participate, we should be able to move on by 5:40. If people ask questions rather than give great speeches. Mr. Nigel Dodds.
Mr. Speaker, the Secretary of State has outlined a number of areas where action is now going to be taken as a result of the Act. But on health, education, crime, policing, investment and all the rest of it, still the government sits on its hands and allows no government for Northern Ireland. Is he now realising that with Brexit coming, that we have to have powers in the hands of ministers, whether in the Assembly or here. You can't go on abdicating that decision. And today in Belfast, Assembly members did meet. The Sinn Féin boycotted it. Given that the Prime Minister said on Saturday that a simple majority should apply in Northern Ireland as well, fully compatible with the Good Friday Agreement, can he apply that principle to the formation of the Executive? Because 4 parties out of 5 would set it up tomorrow.
Mr. Speaker, just to be very clear on the Assembly, the petition of concern and the arrangements for the Assembly will not change under this scenario. I think, I say again, we need Sinn Féin, the DUP, all parties to come together, because powers from here is not the solution to this issue.
The original author of the handbook on succinct questions, Sir John Redwood.
The DUP is understandably very unhappy about the customs and single market arrangements in the agreement. So will the government table a free trade agreement and get on with it? Because that would help.
Mr. Speaker, I'm not responsible for the European negotiations.
Mr. David Hanson.
Given the creation of a new border down the Irish Sea, which will impact upon services in businesses in Ireland and in North Wales and indeed in the rest of the United Kingdom, what impact assessment has the Secretary of State asked to be produced by the Executive to be shared with political parties on the outcome of that border?
Mr. Speaker, on the issue of customs and the protocol, we will be doing everything to work with Northern Ireland businesses to ensure we deliver on unfettered access as we push this bill through the House of Commons. I spoke to Northern Ireland businesses today and will be engaging with them on an ongoing basis as we move forward with the protocol.
Bercow.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Given the absence of an Assembly and Executive, the Historical Institute Abuse Bill has had to be passed through this place, and second reading is in the House of Lords next week. Can I ask the Secretary of State what will happen to that bill should the Assembly be restored? Will we continue with that so that the victims get the compensation they need as soon as possible?
Secretary of State.
I hope that we will and expect that we will continue with that bill to deliver to victims who have waited far too long.
Smith.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Could the Secretary of State confirm, as revealed by the Brexit Secretary in answer to my right honourable friend, the member for Leeds Central, that under the new Brexit dispensation, firms in Northern Ireland exporting to the rest of the UK will now be expected to fill in export forms? And could he tell us how that can be squared with the claim that Northern Ireland will remain part of the UK customs territory?
Mr. Speaker, as Northern Ireland Secretary, I will be fighting for the interests of business and ensuring that we minimise any disruption. To their trade flows. Northern Ireland has a hugely successful business sector, and it will go from strength to strength with this deal.
Mark Harper.
Mr. Speaker, I'm grateful. Just following up on the question from the right honourable member for North Belfast and also from my honourable friend, the chairman of the Select Committee. My understanding is that 4 of the 5 parties in Northern Ireland would like the Executive to be reformed, and it's only Sinn Féin which is holding out for at least the reason my honourable friend, the chairman of the Select Committee, set out, if not others. What does the Secretary of State think is going to change to enable Sinn Féin to be persuaded to restore the Executive? I listened carefully to what he said, and I accept he's working incredibly hard, but I'm still not clear about what is going to change to enable the Executive to be reformed and for Northern Ireland to be able to enjoy devolved government.
Mr. Speaker, Sinn Féin, as with other parties, have been engaging very positively with me, and I have had good conversations with their senior leaders. I think in terms of change, as this House makes a positive decision on Brexit, I think that in the coming days, I think that is a significant change, and that could be the catalyst for further movement on these talks.
Sir Geoffrey Donaldson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I cannot emphasise enough to the Secretary of State how important the principle of consent is to unionists. And the idea that a decision of the momentous nature of the one we will be expected to take in 4 years' time does not reflect adequately the principle of consent as expressed in the Belfast Agreement, has serious implications for our ability to support the restoration of devolution without that safeguard. And I say with all seriousness to the Secretary of State, if this issue is not addressed, it goes well beyond this Brexit deal.
Mr. Speaker, I say again to my colleagues and friends in the DUP and to unionists across this House and in Northern Ireland, this protocol is for a reserved matter. It is not for the Assembly. The Belfast Agreement is extremely clear that there will be matters which will not be subject to the consent mechanisms in the Assembly. The government will continue to work to ensure that this protocol, as the bill goes through Parliament, is executed in a way which is reassuring to all members and all parts of the Northern Ireland community. But remember, the issue with the backstop was a lack of consent. This consent mechanism is intended to deal with it, but it has no effect on the Northern Ireland Assembly.
That service personnel, their families and service veterans are losing out under the terms of the Armed Forces Covenant not being fully applied in Northern Ireland. Will the Secretary of State give consideration to the recommendation made in a recent report by the Defence Select Committee that the Northern Ireland Civil Service should appoint someone directly to sit on the Veterans Board that administers the Covenant?
I pay tribute to my right honourable friend for that report and for his committee's thinking in this area, and I am giving consideration to that report and how we can execute parts of that report in a positive manner to ensure that we deliver to the armed forces who served in Northern Ireland.
Mr. Carmichael. Mr. Speaker, the creation of a customs border down the Irish Sea and the necessary declarations that we now hear will be necessary as a consequence of that is something about which Ruth Davidson and his right honourable friend, the former Secretary of State for Scotland, warned last year. They said then, and it's true now, that it will undermine the Union. Why is the Secretary of State disregarding his right honourable friend's advice?
I'm not disregarding the advice of anybody, but this is a deal that protects the border. This was a key priority for me as Secretary of State. It protects the peace process. The economy of Northern Ireland, I think, will benefit from this deal. We're delivering on Brexit, but protecting the economy, protecting the peace process. And this mechanism, I say again, has no bearing on the Assembly, and I will work over the implementation period with colleagues across government to minimise any problems for Northern Ireland businesses in exporting and selling into Great Britain.
Lawrence Robertson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. We're supposed to live in a democracy, and yet 7 out of the 18 constituencies in Northern Ireland have no representation in this place. And as we've heard, the Assembly has not functioned for getting on for 3 years. Surely it's time to end the prospect of one party being able to bring down the whole institution. Will the Secretary of State consider introducing legislation which stops that from happening again?
Secretary of State.
I think I have no plans for changing the constitution and set-up and basis of the Assembly. I do, however, think that the lack of representation here, 7, 8 constituencies unrepresented, is not a good thing. And also, as I've said earlier, we need to get Stormont up and running. 1,000 days is far too long.
Kate Hoey.
The Secretary of State should be an expert on the protocol. So could I ask him this simple question? It's a friend who gardens. In Northern Ireland, if he buys £2 of organic garlic from a supplier in England, when they see the Northern Ireland address, will they then be obligated to add on the EU tariff, which is currently 10%? And how would he prove he's not moving it to the EU in the Republic? And how would he reclaim the tariff? The agreement says the default assumption is that it is going to the EU, and that's a very important question. That's what people are talking about in Northern Ireland today, not restoring devolution.
As my honourable friend knows, the joint committee in that new protocol will look at all these matters, and these are matters that I expect to be looked at over the coming months as we go through the implementation period.
Eddie Hughes. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Does my right honourable friend share my view that if the Act is extended by a statutory instrument, that will not be a good outcome for the people of Northern Ireland?
I agree with my honourable friend.
Lady Herman.
Thank you very much indeed, Mr. Speaker. As members of the Legislative Assembly at Stormont continue to be unable to fulfil their full responsibilities, what consideration has the Secretary of State given to cutting their salaries yet again? The fact that they receive their salaries, albeit reduced, has caused immense annoyance and continues to cause immense annoyance across Northern Ireland, and has cost millions of pounds. So does the Secretary of State intend to cut them?
I plan to review all elements relating to the Assembly if we're unable to move things forward over the coming days.
Paul Masterson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Post-Brexit, the Northern Ireland Assembly is going to have to take some incredibly serious and important decisions about Northern Ireland's future. Does the kind of shambolic scenes we saw on the Assembly this morning suggest that that institution is actually up to that task? And if not, and if it is not restored, is he happy that he and his department have all the powers necessary in order to take Northern Ireland through the transition and into the immediate period after we've left the EU?
Mr. Speaker, as I said earlier, I think that the parties and the individuals who will play a part in the Assembly and the Executive when it gets up and running again are of extremely high quality. I think there's every opportunity for us to get this up and running and for it to go from strength to strength. I think this is so much more in the best interests of Northern Ireland than taking powers or restoring powers from here.
Call him again.
Mr. Speaker, it's rare these days that a decision made by this House provokes joy and hope, but it will today amongst thousands of people in Northern Ireland who love each other, are in a same-sex relationship and finally will be able to marry the person that they love. But they will be concerned to hear that despite the will of this House to introduce equal marriage to Northern Ireland, not in any segmented form, that those who have had civil partnerships may be forced to delay their conversion into full equal marriage. Can the Secretary of State confirm that this will not be the case and that as of the 13th of January all couples in Northern Ireland who love each other will be able to get married?
Mr. Speaker, as I said at the start of my statement, we will be consulting on religious same-sex marriage and the conversion of civil partnership to marriage, but for all other same-sex marriages, they will be delivered as per the regulations, and again, the first ones will be taking place on the week of Valentine's Day.
Andrew Bowie.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. My right honourable friend has expressed, and I think everybody in this place today has expressed, their concern with the current situation. But after 1,000 days, it does seem like we are in just as bad a position as ever. So what exactly is it that gives the Secretary of State confidence that we are about to find a resolution to this and that devolution will be restored to Stormont in the near future?
Well, having been Government Chief Whip during most of the Brexit period, 1,000 days does not appear quite as bad as it does to others, but it is an awful long time, and we do need to make sure that we now encourage the parties to get back into the Executive. The Taoiseach and I stand ready and plan to work with the parties over the coming days.
Dr. Roberta Blackman-Words.
Mr. Speaker, can the Secretary of State confirm that he will bring forward new legislation on abortion in Northern Ireland promptly? And can he say a little bit more about the process he'll adopt in doing so?
Mr. Speaker, we will be bringing forward a consultation over the coming days. As I said, the decriminalisation and the moratorium on criminal cases takes place from tomorrow, and we will be delivering on the law that now has changed in the new year.
Jim Shannon.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Assembly, as the Secretary of State will know, tried to meet today. Some 33 plus members tried to initiate a debate to stop the abortion legislation going forward in Northern Ireland. The Secretary of State will know that. Unfortunately, government acquiesced to the legislation and made sure it went through here. Does the Secretary of State not understand that the anger that people in Northern Ireland have because of the abortion change? And would he bring in changes for the Health Department, which is going to be £20 million in deficit this year, to ensure that they can operate and do what they need to do in the Health Department in the year ahead?
So I understand the huge sensitivities with regard to this issue, but there was a free vote in this House. The law was clear that for both same-sex marriage and abortion, if the Assembly and Executive weren't up and running by today, then the law would change, and I think we have now reached that point. In terms of funding for abortions, the government will continue to pay for travel costs to England during this period, and going forward, we will make sure, as part of the consultation, as part of the changes, that we do ensure that the health service in Northern Ireland has every resource it requires.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Whilst we urge for a quick and speedy resolution to the impasse in Northern Ireland's restoration of the devolution settlement, does the Minister actually welcome the levelling up of fundamental human rights across all parts of the United Kingdom, and the sort of a liberal grandstanding we saw today was actually most unwelcome and counterproductive?
Mr. Speaker, I say again, I think these are sensitive issues. These are free vote issues. But the law has changed, and this government now will follow through and deliver on it.
Robinson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, these responses are calamitous. For the Secretary of State to hold up a copy of the Belfast Agreement, yet not having appraised himself with Strand 2, paragraph 12, or Strand 1, 5b, which outlined further expansion of North-South arrangements subject to the Assembly consent, and 5b indicating how that consent operates, right. It is an outrage. And whilst he said to the BBC last Thursday that no party would have a veto, Sinn Féin operated their veto on the restoration of the institutions today and have done for the last 1,000 days, and the EU will have a veto in this joint committee. Can he answer that question that was asked earlier? Is it the case that Northern Ireland goods will require customs declarations to enter what is supposed to be unfettered access to the rest of their own country?
So on the first point, Mr. Speaker, I say again to my honourable friend, there is no change to the Constitution of the Assembly. This is an accepted matter, and it's a reserved matter, and we will do everything we can to deliver on assuaging many of the concerns that have been raised. On the issue of checks and forms and unfettered access is a key part of this protocol, and I'll be working to ensure that we deliver on that in the interest of Northern Ireland business over the coming weeks.
Order. Statement, the business statement. The Lord President of the Council and Leader of the House of Commons. Mr. Jacob Rees-Mogg.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Following the decision of the House on Saturday, the 19th October, I should like to make an announcement regarding the business for the remainder of this week. Tuesday, the 22nd of October, second reading of the European Union Withdrawal Agreement Bill, followed by commencement of committee of the European Union Withdrawal Agreement Bill. Wednesday, the 23rd of October, continuation of proceedings on the European Union Withdrawal Agreement Bill. Thursday, the 24th of October, conclusion of proceedings on the European Union Withdrawal Agreement Bill. Friday, the 25th of October, the House will not be sitting.
Thank you. Order. I'll call in a moment the Shadow Leader, who doubtless will have a prepared contribution, but I must emphasise to the House that I regard this as a relatively narrow business statement, and I would gently discourage colleagues from expatiating on a vast miscellany of matters which they could happily do on Thursday. Let's keep it narrow, because that's what it should be. The Shadow Leader, Valerie Vaz.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, but I do want to start, because this is the first opportunity that I have had on behalf of the opposition to thank the Clerk of the House as the senior accounting officer responsible for the House, and all the House staff and the doorkeepers and the security officers for looking after us and enabling the House to get together on Saturday to do our work, and also the police and security services who have escorted right honourable and honourable members and their families on their way home and keeping us safe. Can I thank the Leader for the business statement? I was obviously disappointed that the leader didn't give me notice on Saturday that he was going to make a point of order. He will know that a point of order is not the way to alter business. It's a procedural motion of the House on which Mr. Speaker can rule. So it would have been helpful if the Leader of the House could have done so. He will know that on that historic day, 24 points of order on his point of order were made. And my first question to him would be, why did he leave the chamber when he couldn't hear the rest of the points of orders? He will need to know he is the voice of the House in government. Can I ask him also, because he hasn't mentioned when we're going to have those important debates on the Queen's speech, which were scheduled for Monday and Tuesday. I know that the government don't appear to care about the NHS or the economy. We on this side think they're very important topics. This all could have been done in an orderly manner. So could the Leader of the House please say when those, the remainder of the Queen's speech will be scheduled? The withdrawal agreement bill is a crucial bill. It's vital that it receives the proper scrutiny of the House. So could the Leader of the House say when exactly the bill will be published? And it's not right that the Secretary of State for exiting the European Union says it has anything to do with an urgent question. The bill should be published in a timely manner so that it receives proper scrutiny of the House. And when will the programme motion be put forward? Could the Leader of the House also confirm that the government has no plans to pull the withdrawal agreement bill and that it will be voted on if and as amended? Now, this whole process could have been conducted in an orderly manner. He will know that there is an appropriate way through the usual channels to fix the business of the House. At every stage, Mr. Speaker, the government has been running scared of this House and democracy, and it's now attempting to force through a flawed Brexit deal which sells out people's jobs, rights and our communities.
The Leader of the House.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Right Honourable Lady is absolutely right to thank the clerk and the staff of this House, who were all absolutely magnificent. I will reiterate what I said before, that every member of my private office volunteered to come in on Saturday, and I think that is simply an example of the commitment to the House of Commons that we see from all our staff, and it is really rather wonderful that so many people who work here appreciate and value the Houses of Parliament and have the historic understanding of what a privilege it is to be here. May I add my thanks, and joining the Right Honourable Lady, to the police for the escorts they provided to get people home, including me. I've had many really very kind inquiries about my son. He is a 12-year-old boy. He found nothing more exciting than being escorted home by the police. I'm not sure he should have found it so exciting, but he did. But as a really serious point, I think it is very important that honourable and right honourable members can come and go from the precincts of Parliament feeling safe. And we must think about whether there is more we need to do and whether sessional orders may be helpful in that regard. But all honourable and right honourable members are representing 70,000, sometimes more, constituents and must be able to come here and go without any feeling that they are under any pressure from any group outside Parliament. The Right Honourable Lady refers to my point of order on Saturday. As you all know, there's long-standing precedent for this. One of the examples actually by my late godfather, Norman St John Stevens, in 1980. A more recent one by my Right Honourable friend, the member of Epsom and Ewell, and one only in September by my Right Honourable friend, the Prime Minister. But also, the Right Honourable Ladies, I'm sure aware, as are you, Mr. Speaker, of page 408 of Erskine May, that gives the Speaker discretion to turn a substantive point of order into a statement had he so wished. Mr. Speaker did not so wish, and therefore I made 2 points of order to help the House and to understand what the business would be today, with, of course, the promise of a full statement today, which is exactly what is happening. And there are going to be occasions when business changes in response to votes. That is a perfectly normal system within this House. On the Queen's speech, yes, of course we will come back to the Queen's speech, but we do have a deadline of the 31st of October, a deadline set in law for dealing with our departure from the European Union, and we need to have the legislation in place by then, or the alternative is that we leave without a deal. The right honourable lady asked about the bill. Well, I know there is... I'm sorry, speak up. Oh, the right honourable lady asked why I left the chamber. That's extremely straightforward. Matters of points of order are for the chair. They're not for the leader of the House. It would be an impertinence of me to think that I could possibly know more than Mr. Speaker about the proceedings and order of this House, and I would not like to give the impression of having knowledge that I could not pretend to have. It is for Mr. Speaker to rule on points of order, not for other honourable members. I had made my point of order and listened to several other points of order, but there were no further opportunities for me to speak because it was a matter for the chair. The bill will be published very shortly. The presentation of bill will be the first item of public business when we come on to the business of the day, and at that point, simultaneously as if by magic, the bill will appear in the vote office for honourable and right honourable members to peruse, and I'm sure they will enjoy that. The programme motion will be down tonight in an orderly way. Well, I hope it will be an orderly way. Mr. Speaker will rule on that. If it's not, for debate tomorrow, and the bill, of course, won't be pulled. But the right honourable lady is one of the most charming members of this House, has enormous grace and thoughtfulness. But when she said we were running scared of democracy, I think she must have been trying to pull our collective legs, Mr. Speaker. It is this government that has offered a general election not just once, but twice. I mean, how frightened is that of democracy? We are so terrified of the voters that we want them to have the chance to vote, so scared that we feel that they should be allowed to go to the ballot box. No. If there is any scaredness, if there is any frightenedness, if anybody is frit, Mr. Speaker, they're on the opposition benches.
Let me endorse what the Leader of the House said in all solemnity about the absolute and precious right of members of this place and of staff to go about their business safely and unimpeded. That has to be an absolute and non-negotiable. And where that right has been threatened, that threat is to be unequivocally condemned. And sometimes I fear that people think that one form of hollering or protest is acceptable and another is not. The truth is that no such behaviour, which could be intimidating or threatening or worse, can possibly be justified in our democracy. I note what the leader said more widely about points of order. Points of order are a matter for response by the chair. It was not, nevertheless, an obligation of the leader to beetle out of the chamber during the said points of order, given that most of them were proxies for commentaries upon his own. Nevertheless, I note what he said. There was no disinclination on my part for there to be an emergency business statement. I had rather thought that that was what the leader was going to proffer, and therefore there was just a genuine misunderstanding between us on that point. But I ascribe no ulterior motive to the leader, and I know that he would not to me. Sir Patrick McLaughlin.
Can I, however, press the Leader on the House as to when we will have the conclusion of the Queen's speech? We've always known the 31st of October was a date, and we always knew when the Queen's speech was going to be, and presumably that was at the timing of the government's agreement with the Palace. The fact is that Parliament has spent the best part of 3 years now discussing what it doesn't want. It is time for us to move on. I welcome a business statement today. Will we get an opportunity, therefore, to actually have a direct vote on what the Prime Minister has brought forward back to the House, which is not the Prime Minister's deal, but it is the deal between the European Union and the British government?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My right honourable friend makes an excellent point. We have spent the best part of 3 years debating these matters in this House at inordinate length. It is amazing that anybody thinks there is anything more to be said on the subject that has not already been said. The first opportunity, subject to your ruling earlier today, to vote on the content of the agreement between Her Majesty's Government and the European Union will be on the second reading of the bill tomorrow.
Thank you. Pete Wishart.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I thank the House for announced in his short business statement today. And can I endorse what you said, Mr Speaker, the Leader of the House and the Shadow Leader of the House, just about the way that this House was organised so efficiently on Saturday, and I think it was credit to everybody who works in this place that they were able to do that. And can I say I was appalled at the scenes of the Right Honourable Gentleman and his son being harangued the way he does, and there is no excuse for that type of behaviour in and around the House. Mr Speaker, it's also entirely right that the Leader of the House was refused his right to bring back that motion again today. He had an opportunity to engage meaningfully with the meaningful vote, but he chose not to, and he simply cannot bring it back on the terms that they choose and dictate. This House operates on the basis of motions, amendments to motions, and democracy requires that this process is observed. As we would say in this House, no one messes with Erskine May, Mr Speaker. But what he proposes in this business statement, again, around the withdrawal agreement bill, is totally unacceptable. We will be considering the second reading of this bill the same day as it starts with committee of the whole House. Now, I've been in this House 18 years, Mr Speaker. I cannot remember when a bill has been debated and presented in such terms, particularly one that will be a full treaty of this country. 3 days to consider a bill. Somebody suggested it's 100 pages. If it's 100 pages, how on earth are we going to have a chance to assess that properly? No economic impacts, no economic assessments. And, Leader of the House, what about the Constitutional Reform and Governance Act 2010, which requires any treaty to be laid before the House for 21 days before it can be ratified? What about devolved institutions and administrations, where legislative consent is required before any bill is passed? Mr Speaker, the arrangements for this bill are simply not good enough, but at least we're seeing a change in government business announced by the conventional means of a business statement. And I hope we will never hear from him again changing significant government business by way of a point of order. And he talked about when he left the chamber, Mr Speaker. My honourable friend, the member from Glasgow North, was addressing the House at that point as he breezed past him. That is not the way for a Leader of the House to behave. And, Mr Speaker, the Queen's speech. It was only last week when we asked Her Majesty to put on her best crown, get into a stage coach and come to Parliament to read out the Conservatives' next election manifesto. When are we going to get the Queen's speech? When is it coming back? Was all that just a supreme waste of time?
Yes,
Mr Speaker, the Prime Minister may have died in that ditch as the white flag was raised in the so-called surrender bill, but we will not give up, ensuring that this bill gets the proper scrutiny that it requires.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. As always, it is a pleasure to listen to the honourable gentleman. There are a number of points that he made there. First of all, I would quibble over whether Her Majesty came wearing her best crown or not. I think her best crown is probably the crown of King Edward the Confessor, which is only used at the coronation. I think for the state opening of Parliament, the imperial state crown is probably Her Majesty's second best crown, but far be it from me to be pedantic about such matters. The issue on CRAG, the Constitutional Reform and Governance Act, the CRAG Act will be taken care of in the bill. The point of CRAG is to ensure that non-legislative treaties have an ability in this House to be voted on. Legislative ones inevitably fall into a different category. And I think the honourable gentleman must have a remarkably short memory, because he said he could not recall any bill being brought through at such short notice. There have been 2 bills in the last year. One colloquially known as the Benn Act, another known as the Cooper-Bowles Act. But I would also remind honourable and right honourable members that the application was dealt with in 24 hours. A King Emperor left in 24 hours, and we are removing an imperial yoke in over a week.
I'm looking to move on at 6:15, so it may well be that not everybody gets in. Sir William Cash.
With regard to what happened on Saturday, I'd simply make the point that, as in the case of my right honourable friend, the Leader of the House and his son, and indeed with another Secretary of State as well, I too was subjected to an attempt to take me out, I suppose you would say. But I have to say that there was a remarkable response. Not that I was the slightest bit phased.
Order. I don't wish to be unkind or discourteous to the honourable gentleman, but what I'm looking for is single-sentence questions. You know, I'm very sorry if the honourable gentleman was unhappily interrupted, but I want a single-sentence question, not an explanation of his experience on Saturday. Sir William Cash.
The police were very good. But in respect of this bill, I entirely endorse what my right honourable friend has said regarding the Ben Act, which was pushed through in a completely unacceptable manner, tearing up Standing Order 14, whereas this bill is in accordance with all the proper procedures and actually would deal with the constitutional freedom of this country so we regain our self-government.
Sorry to say that the Honourable Gentleman Member for Stone has expressed his views with great force, but he's in violation of the convention relating to the business statement in the way that the Leader of the House said was true of the Right Honourable Gentleman Member for Leeds Central the other day, as a consequence of which no response to the question is required. Mr Hilary Benn.
Thanks, Mr Speaker. Can the Leader of the House confirm that the withdrawal agreement bill that's about to be published will disapply the requirement under the Constitutional Reform and Governance Act that any treaty is laid before the House for 21 days before it can be ratified?
Mr Speaker, the Honourable Gentleman's done exactly the same.
Sir John Redwood.
What is the deadline for amendments, as we still haven't seen the bill, and to what hour would the government propose we sit on these 3 days?
Mr Speaker, a motion is down in my name for later on this day, allowing for amendments to be put in prior to the second reading. If that motion is approved by the House, it will be possible to put them in later on today, by which time the bill will have been approved, and the motion for the programme will be set out tonight before the rise of the House.
Mr Ian Mearns.
Grateful, Mr Speaker. Mr Speaker, it would be churlish of me in the current context to be asking for additional time for backbench business. And I was mindful of and very much regret the harassment that the Leader of the House got when he departed from the House on Saturday. But with that in mind, I understand that the government may suggest that over the next 3 days that we might sit until any hour. And if that is the case, I just hope the government would be mindful of the welfare of all members of this House, including backbenchers, as they come to and leave the House on all occasions.
Say, by the way, in case the Honourable Gentleman for Stone thought I was being churlish, which was certainly not my intention, that as far as I'm concerned, and long may it remain so, the Honourable Gentleman Member for Stone is indestructible. He's indestructible. The Leader of the House.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Though I would add that the Attorney-General sitting next to me pointed out that the treatment of my honourable friend, the Member for Stone, was particularly unpleasant, and so it is another opportunity to thank the police for their sterling work. And they are very brave in doing this because they are very heavily outnumbered, and so I just add that. May I begin by congratulating the honourable gentleman on being re-elected unanimously. It is a rare thing in this House to be so highly esteemed by honourable and right honourable members that no one dares even enter into the contest. So I congratulate him, and the point he makes is a really serious one, and I hope will be communicated to the Sergeant-at-Arms so that appropriate measures can be taken.
Ian Smith.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. May I thank the Leader of the House for confirming what I suspect the rest of the country has long thought, which is that the Queen's speech doesn't really matter to this government, it's a sham, which is why it's now been postponed. But may I ask him, as someone who clearly believes in historic precedent in this case, is he serious that we're going to try and ram through this bill dealing with an international treaty in 3 days, when Lisbon was debated for 11 days, I believe, Maastricht for 23, Treaty of Rome for 22. Is he serious about this?
Mr Speaker, the honourable gentleman's appetite for debate is touching. That we have been debating these matters for 3 years. We have had endless debates. We have had endless statements by both this Prime Minister and from his predecessor. We have had endless reports from the Brexit Select Committee. It is hard to think of any matter that has been more carefully looked at, and rather splendidly, not just by this House, but by the country at large, who have engaged with politics. And one of the great virtues of Brexit has been the way it has encouraged our constituents to be interested in our activities.
Crispin Blunt.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Having noted the careful crafting of your statement today and your response to my point of order about change of circumstances, could my right honourable friend tell the House when the government thinks there will be a potential case for change of circumstances in order that we can actually get what the country needs, which is a straightforward vote on the withdrawal agreement?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Earlier you were kind enough to quote what I said on the 18th of March, but not, I fear, in full, because I went on to make another sentence, which was, dare I say, that there is more joy in heaven over one sinner who repenteth than over the 99 who are not in need of repentance. Because, Mr. Speaker, I, like my right honourable friend, am greatly in favour of continuing to follow precedents and using them as a guide, and they are a guide, and the guide in this case may be what you yourself, Mr. Speaker, said on that day. It depends on the particular circumstances. For example, it depends whether one is facilitating the House and allowing the expression of opinion that might otherwise be denied. And I think this has been a very important guide to the decisions that you have made, both recently and historically in your term as Speaker. So no doubt these things will be in your mind as you deliberate and consider further what my right honourable friend has said.
Yes, and in relation to column 778 of Hansard, on the 18th of March of this year, and I don't want to be anything but fully generous to the Leader of the House, there was a further segment, a very delicious and juicy segment in his question to me, and that was, if memory serves me correctly, whether there would be an opportunity for decision via the second reading of the withdrawal bill. And I confirmed in my reply to him that his thinking on that matter was correct. So I completely accept the sinner and the repenteth bit, and it was only in the name of time that I didn't quote that, but I'm quoting another part. So we've now got the full smorgasbord of the intervention of the right honourable gentleman before he became a right honourable gentleman. Mr. Alistair Carmichael.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The requirement to lay treaties for 21 days before ratification is contained in Section 20 of the Constitutional Reform and Governance Act of 2010. Can the Leader of the House point to me where in Section 20 of that Act the distinction is drawn between treaties that are legislative and non-legislative in their effect?
Mr. Speaker, I think the point is extremely obvious, that if Parliament is legislating for something, it is voting on it. Under Cragg, there is no need to have a vote on a treaty that is laid in front of this House.
Mark Harper.
Mr. Speaker, I listened carefully to what the Leader said. He set out in his business statement the government's intentions for how long the bill should take through the House. Now, that will only, of course, happen if the House agrees by voting for the programme motion. Now, on Saturday, when the House failed to take a decision in principle following my right honourable friend, the member for West Dorset's amendment being successfully carried, many that voted for his amendment were clear that they wanted the House to be able to vote on this deal and actually get it through. And I think that even the Shadow Chancellor suggested that it could get through by the 31st of October. It's only going to do so if that programme motion is carried. Can my right honourable friend confirm to the House that if any member votes against that programme motion, it will be fairly clear that what they were doing on Saturday and what they'll be doing tomorrow is not trying to give the House more opportunity to consider this matter, but they're actually trying to frustrate the decision being taken.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My right honourable friend's grasp of detail is so great that it explains why Baroness Hale thought he was the Chief Whip, that he is clearly completely on top of the subject, and it's an entirely understandable error to have made. He is, of course, absolutely right, and there is a very serious point in this. People who don't vote for the programme motion will be voting not to have Brexit on the 31st of October, and they will need to understand that clearly, and they won't be able to persuade one set of people that they voted for the second reading and therefore in favour, and another set that they voted against the timetable and were against. That won't work.
Caroline Lucas.
Mr. Speaker, this government proposal is frankly outrageous given the length and complexity of this bill. I understand the Leader of the House to indicate that we would have to put amendments to committee stage before we've even finished the second reading. And the complexity of the bill, Mr. Speaker, seems to have confused the Prime Minister himself, who on Saturday, for example, said there would be no tariffs on goods going between the Northern Ireland and Great Britain. And in actual fact, Article 5 shows that those goods that are at risk of entering the EU could indeed face tariffs. tariff. So isn't that precisely the sort of detail we expect the government to get right, and more evidence that we need the time to scrutinise this bill properly?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. There will not be tariffs on goods that are ending up in Northern Ireland. If they're going into the European Union, there may be, but there will not be goods that are destined for Northern Ireland and not for onward transmission. And so what the Prime Minister said was correct. I think that people who voted for the Benn Act and the Cooper Bowles Act are on pretty thin ice when they complain about rushing acts through. Mr. Speaker, goose and gander sauce.
Mr. Owen Paterson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I accepted your earlier statement. I agreed entirely with you on substance, but I don't entirely agree with you on circumstances. Because the House passed the amendment put forward by my right honourable and very old friend, member for West Dorset, who put forward his amendment, I'm sure with the very best intentions, it has driven 17.4 million people into a state of utter exasperation. They are convinced, members opposite laugh, they are convinced that this Remain Parliament is determined to frustrate them at every turn. So what the Leader of the House has brought forward today is welcome, and my question is simple. When does he think this House may have a chance to debate amendments coming back from the Lords, and when does he see royal prorogation passed so that we can deliver what the 17.4 wanted to leave on the 31st?
Mr. Speaker, those great words, la reine la volte, are what we are all looking forward to in relation to the bill that will be published shortly. I will set out the further timetable for the further stages on Thursday in the normal way, but it is all contingent on the second reading tomorrow and indeed on the programme motion. But I absolutely share my right honourable friend's concern that this matter has dragged on for too long. The British people want us to crack on and get it delivered and deal with Brexit. And it's not just the 17.4 million people. It is up and down this country. People voted for parties who said they would deliver on the referendum result. And one party is trying to do that and one party is trying to frustrate it.
Sir Geoffrey Donaldson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. We did not vote for the Benn Act. We want Brexit done, but we want to safeguard Northern Ireland's position within the United Kingdom. When Unionists in Northern Ireland voted for Brexit, they also voted to sustain the United Kingdom. And therefore, in the absence of the kind of assurances we need from ministers, I have to say to the Leader of the House, quite frankly, that what he's proposing in terms of proper scrutiny of this bill does not do justice to what the constituents that I represent need.
Well said.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm very grateful to the right honourable gentleman for his intervention. Let me say quite clearly that there is nothing more important to me than the United Kingdom, and that is the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland, Scotland, Wales, England and Northern Ireland. I have said many times, and am more than happy to reiterate at this dispatch box, that Northern Ireland is as much a part of the United Kingdom as Somerset, and that as long as the people of Northern Ireland want to remain part of the United Kingdom, they should be supported, encouraged and helped in that. It is our country. It is the United Kingdom. Therefore, I hope that such assurances as our friends in the DUP want and our other unionist friends need can be made to encourage them to believe that this deal will in fact be good for the whole of the United Kingdom, which is what I genuinely think is the case, and I hope that we will come to find that we share that view rather than being in contradistinction one from another, which is a matter of sadness to me and I think to right honourable gentlemen opposite.
Steve Baker.
Approach the withdrawal agreement bill, is my right honourable friend mindful that many of the same members who insisted on statutory meaningful votes are the same members who then voted for the Surrender Act, the same members who then voted on Saturday to make a meaningful vote meaningless, and now seem to be opposed to Brexit altogether?
Oh, thank you, Mr. Speaker. My successor and predecessor as chairman of the European Research Group, as so often hits the nail on the head. There are many people who don't like Brexit at all, who have opposed it from the beginning, and they use this great mantra. They say, we don't like this, we don't like to leave with no deal, etc., etc. And actually what they mean is they don't like Brexit and they didn't like the referendum and they want to stop it. That's not true of all of them, and my from the beginning, and they use this great mantra. They say, we don't like this, we don't like to leave with no deal, etc., etc. And actually what they mean is they don't like Brexit and they didn't like the referendum.